Okay, good evening. I'm going to call the Wednesday, June 24th meeting of the Community Budget Advisory Committee to order. And the first item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Do I hear a motion to approve the agenda?
So move.
It's been moved by Co-Chair Peterson and seconded by Commissioner Locks to approve the agenda. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, the motion carries unanimously. Next up is the approval of the minutes from the last meeting. Any discussion on the minutes or a motion would be in order?
Mr. Chair, I move the approval of the minutes.
Okay, there's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by Locks and seconded by Kunkel for approval of the minutes. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll come to a vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, the minutes are approved unanimously. First up would be 4.1, information and updates. And is that going to be you, Jamie, or who's going to go first?
It's going to be me.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. It's good to see you again. So this is just going to be a quick presentation, just giving you some more information about some items that were brought up at the last meeting. So first one was some questions about the general fund reserve goal. And just wanted to expand on that the City of Bloomington's general fund balance reserve goal is typically at 40% of revenues, as opposed to the state's minimum recommendation of 35%. And that is due to the fact that Bloomington is different than many Minnesota cities, and that a significant amount of revenue is from the local lodging tax. And as we can see right now, that can be impacted by economic downturns, as we are currently experiencing. And just wanted to also just give further information about guidance from the Office of the State Auditor. So they have a statement of position on fund balances. So the Office of the State Auditor, the OSA, recommends that local governments that rely significantly on property taxes maintain fund balance of approximately 35 to 50% of operating revenues in their general fund. And then adequacy of fund balance should be assessed based on an individual local government's own circumstances. So this fund balance should provide the local government with adequate funds until the next property tax revenue collection cycle, since we just receive property taxes twice a year. And that local governments should also take a position on the level of fund balance and other funds to consider long-term forecasting and planning issues. So just to give some information from the Office of the State Auditor in regards to how the City of Bloomington has normally a goal of 40% of revenues. And then just wanted to give you just some more information about our special revenue funds. We last week had talked about that we were going to be focusing on two of them that receive property tax revenue. And there was a request from Chair Steve Peterson about maybe there's some other special revenue funds we'd want to look into. So I'm just going to give you some information here, and after presenting this, just to get your feedback if there are other special revenue funds that you would like more information on to look at as part of your work. So just as a reminder, the special revenue funds are used to account for proceeds of specific revenue sources that are restricted or committed to expenditures for specified purposes. So they're outside of the general fund. So there's 12 of them. And there's the cemetery fund, and that was established in, well, the fund wasn't established in 1858, but the cemetery was established in 1858 and offers burial options with the city. And there's preferred pricing for those that meet eligibility requirements. And so the revenues here are from the sales of burial lots, cremation lots, columbarium niches, and related fees. And just to give you a sense of the amount of revenue, for 2020, the budget was $212,850. The next special revenue fund, communications, and this I have in blue because this is one that we're going to be looking at. It does take property tax support. It's a full-service shop, uses multiple communication vehicles, has cable casts and webcasts, produces a news magazine show, videos, maintains the city's website, social media, operates public access television, and there's a monthly newsletter. And it's funded by the PEG fees, and PEG stands for Public Education Government, received from cable companies who provide cable service in the city. And the PEG fees are restricted to capital expenditures for PEG cable programming. The franchise fees are not restricted in this way. However, we do use them all for communications, and in recent years, they have not been enough to cover the expenses of this fund, and so it has required property tax support. So the total revenue budget, $1.9 million, and then the property taxes portion, $250,000. Another special revenue fund is creative placemaking. So this, the revenue is transferred from the South Loop Capital Improvement Fund into a creative placemaking fund. And this fund, the purpose of it is to build vibrant, distinctive, and sustainable communities through the arts. So it engages artists and stakeholders in building social fabric and local economies while making physical, place-based improvements. And so the revenue budget for the Creative Placemaking Fund was $430,325 in 2020. And again, this comes from the South Loop Capital Improvement Fund. The DWI Fund, it's Driving While Intoxicated Forfeiture Fund. It accumulates proceeds from the sale of vehicles seized in DWI arrests and forfeited in accordance with state law. And police costs for enforcement and a portion of legal costs are accounted for in this fund. The revenue budget for 2020 was $61,000. Enhanced 911 receives funds from 911 service fees, comes from the state. They specifically need to be used for 911 services, and 2020 revenue, $111,789. And then we have some federal drug forfeiture funds, and these are very specific funds. They have to have special, separate bank accounts. There's a Department of Justice that separately tracks the sharing drug forfeiture funds. The revenue budget was $30,000 for 2020. And then there's it's a similar fund. It's the Department of Treasury, and the difference there is if there's drug forfeitures and there is money laundering involved, and it goes through Treasury. And rarely do we have funds, this type of forfeiture fund, so we don't even budget. So we have a budget of $0 for this fund. The next one is the fire pension, and this is blue because it also does require property taxes. And as we discussed last week, kind of in detail, how we have a paid on-call fire department, and there is a pension after 20 years of service, and the revenue is $2.7 million, and the property tax portion is $1,050,000. Another fund is park grants special revenue. There's a lottery in lieu of sales tax revenue from the state's Environment and Natural Resources Fund, along with legacy revenues from the state's Parks and Trails Fund. So these revenues are restricted to use for operational and maintenance costs associated with the Highland Bush Anderson Lakes Regional Park Reserve. And the 2020 revenue budget was almost $96,000. This next one, the Police Grants Fund, these are just specifically for police department pursues both federal and state sources as a means of enhancing enforcement efforts. And the revenue for 2020 was $0, and that's because each individual grant is brought individually to the council for approval as a budget adjustment. And just as a reference, in 2019, the revenue was $550,000. And then the last two, the South Loop Revolving Development Services Fund. This fund is supported by a 65% building permit surcharge in the South Loop District. And the purpose of this fund is to expedite development in the South Loop District. 2020 revenue budget was $354,000. And then finally, the State Drug Forfeiture Fund. This is the drug forfeiture fund for the state and for seized assets that are seized in drug-related arrests under state laws. And the funds must also be used for law enforcement purposes, and the revenue budget for 2020 is $46,000. So I just wanted to give you some more information about the different special revenue funds and just give you a sense of the amount of revenue budgeted, and just to find out if there are any other funds that you would like the committee to have more information presented to look at.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
let me ask a question on two of them that caught my eye. The creative placemaking. Yeah, 430,000. Again, is that a restricted fund, or is that have some discretion could be made on that?
Yes, that would be great.
We don't have no audio there for you. Maybe you can come up to maybe that table. The mic at the table there is available, I think, Lori. There we go.
Chairman Peterson, as the funds came from the South Loop Fund, they carry with it the same restrictions as the South Loop Fund. So those funds can only be spent within the South Loop for creative placemaking.
Okay. And the South Loop revolving is the same restriction?
The South Loop revolving, it has, the funds that come from it are from development activities within the South Loop area. And it's predominantly described to be used for studies, traffic studies, those type of things, to enhance the South Loop area.
So those funds would not be available to help us out?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, John.
Chair Peterson, just I apologize. Just for a context for me, the fire pension fund, did I understand last week that we've elected to do this paid on call approach, and that's what puts us into funding this pension, but if we had a more, not a paid on call, but a more conventional full-time fire department, for lack of the right word, how would the pensions be paid there? It's like a PRA scheme, isn't it, if you go the other route?
I don't think you have audio there, so.
There we go.
There we
Try
go.
that again.
Yep.
Yes, for firefighters for any city in Minnesota who are full-time firefighters, they would be in PERA in the police and fire fund where our full-time police officers are, and we would contribute to that pension according to a schedule established in state statute.
So if I could follow up, just to understand that, is there much of a difference in the amounts between these two funds? In other words, if it was the PRA approach, would the cost of the city be materially different than this approach?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question directly. It's different. It would be more consistent because it wouldn't be based on investment and sort of what the stock market is doing. Every 2 weeks, you would send in a certain set amount. My gut reaction is that it would be more expensive, but we've never gone far enough in considering a full-time fire department to actually calculate that out on a forecasting basis.
Where we, and I remember from when I was on the council, we had a little bit of a conversation about it, and it would probably be interesting to get an update. But if I remember right, back then, the big difference wasn't around the pension cost, it was around the payroll cost. In that the payroll cost for the full-time fire department is substantially higher. If I'm remembering, this is probably at least 10 years ago, it was probably on the order of $5 million for the payroll, the kind of difference in the payroll cost, and that'd be in 10 years ago dollars, so you'd adjust that. So when we looked at this, if you looked at kind of the total, what it cost you to have a fire department, this was by far the most cost-effective way to deliver that service in the city versus having a full-time department. John.
Mr. Chair, John, a couple of differences is that the Bloomington firefighters get a very minimal fee for every fire they attend and have to maintain a certain percentage of fires that they attend so they qualify for their pension. But it's a straight 20 years. In PERA, to take a pension without penalty, you have to be 55 years old. So you can collect this fire pension a lot earlier, maybe as many as 15 years earlier, because you could potentially collect it at about age 40 without penalty. there's no penalty clause in the Bloomington fire, but there is in PERA, and you have to be older.
Okay.
So there's a difference of payouts much quicker in the Bloomington fire.
I'm seeing that that Lori might have something to say about that. Do you want to comment on that?
Councilmember, or Commissioner Peterson, Commissioner Lux, I believe they have to be age 50 to collect. And at the fire pension also.
Other questions? Did that answer your question,
Yeah,
John?
thank you. I
Okay.
just didn't have a sense of it.
Okay. Other questions on the topic? My interest in this was just making sure that there weren't any, and I think the other co-chair that Neil was wondering the same thing, is that there weren't other kind of pots of money here that could potentially be in play. And I went and looked at the details behind the federal forfeiture things just to understand what the rules were on that, and they were very specific in there that, you know, if the city gets $100,000 and you cut the budget by $100,000, they're going to take that $100,000 and grab it back. So they want it to be incremental money, and they were very specific about that specific scenario in the instructions that they had on that. So at least in looking at the presentation here, it didn't look like any of these funds that we talked about here had substantial meaningful amounts that could be in play outside of what we're already talking about in the process. Any other questions before we move on? Kari, was there anything else that you wanted to talk about regarding the information and updates?
No, that was it. Thank you, Chair Peterson.
Okay. Next up on the agenda is the charter, and we had a electronic copy that was sent out to folks. There's also, I believe, one in the packet. If you need to refer to it in the packet, it's like page 37 in the packet that's at each person's spot here. It looks like the key changes to it were kind of some proposed language around the conduct and the administrative procedures. And Jamie, were you going to talk about this a little
I
bit?
am. Thank you, Chair Peterson. The substantial changes are on pages 40 and 41 of the paper packet. And it is method of operation is reflecting the conversation the committee had last week about the decision-making and the desire to have a consensus-based decision-making approach, but also recognizing that we would like to have some description of what the process might be if we can't achieve consensus. And so if you look at the bottom of page 40, it says if consensus cannot be achieved by those present, the co-chairs will jointly declare that a vote to proceed will take place. So the co-chairs will have to agree that we're going to move to a vote. Then the next clause in that sentence there, in which case a majority of all committee members will be required for a vote to prevail. So the intent here is to say no matter how many people are at the meeting, you have to have a majority of the whole committee for a vote. So that's something I don't know if anybody has qualms about. And then the next sentence that's in italics is really the point of this whole thing. It being the desire of the committee to achieve consensus, the co-chairs are expected to make every effort to gain consensus before resorting to a vote. So the idea is that we're going to stay in that conversation as long as possible until you decide there's an impasse that we just have to vote. And like I say, then it's up to the chairs to agree that that's the situation. So that was trying to reflect the input that the committee members provided during the conversation last week. And then under conduct, this is just
Hey,
talking.
Jamie, why don't we stop there and let's just
Okay,
talk about these
sure.
as we go. So that I guess on that first point that Jamie talked about here regarding the process, I'd like to get folks' feedback on that or kind of people's consent that that's the way that we're going to operate. Seeing some nods, I see John and Josh have their hands up. Go ahead.
I would just say, and I don't know that it's inconsistent with what I just heard, but I was struck by the observation that it might serve us well not to, bookmark items, but rather, cross things off the list so we don't get to that point at the end of a process where there were so many open issues that we're rushed into a report and all of a sudden it's darn near yay or nay, and if there are nays, it doesn't play out. So I was struck by that observation, and as I was driving home, I was thinking, there's a lot of wisdom in that. So I throw it out there. I don't know that this is inconsistent with that, but I support the idea.
Okay, thank you. Josh?
Mr. Chair, members, would you maybe just share your approach to how do we know we have consensus?
Kind of historically, when I've run committees like this, I ask questions like I just did around, getting people's feedback and say, do people have input? Do they want to have change? A lot of times what I will do is I will float something and say, I'm hearing that, people agree on this. And that'd be the point where someone could come and say, well, no, or I want to talk more. But generally speaking, it'll be pretty clear that I'm trying to rope people into making a decision or kind of declare themselves one way or the other as part of it. And that's I think as we start to get a rhythm of making decisions, you'll kind of, it'll be obvious when I'm kind of calling the question on things and saying, okay, are we ready to decide that we agree on this, or we're going to have some sort of disagreement, or we need to talk about it further. Jessica.
How would you think if one person has a stronger voice and influence somebody else? How would you avoid that?
Well, and this is one thing I talked about at the meeting last time, is I'm keeping track of who is speaking in what order, and so I work hard to try to rotate the kind of the speaking around. Another tactic that I've used in the past is if we're having a conversation and somebody is interested in it, and then we get to the point of the consensus, and I'm not hearing them saying, "Oh, I think this is a great thing." If you're that person, you may find me calling on you and saying, I'll say, Jessica, I heard you talking about this earlier. How are you feeling about where we're at right now? So, I work hard to try to create windows for people to be able to kind of come and participate in the conversation. And if you feel like things are moving too quickly, and one of the issues that we have to manage in this is making sure that we can't make 1,000 decisions, because it's going to be like the decision factory in here if we've got to make 1,000 decisions. But if you feel like things are moving too quickly and you leave the meeting thinking, that went too fast, you should come and tell me that and let me know. And you can call me on the phone or send me an email. I'd be happy to hear from you if you feel like that's happening.
Sure.
Neil.
But wouldn't we call for the agreement that we have a consensus before we move to the
Right.
next topic?
Yep. Yeah, so
We'd have to look around.
Yeah.
Do we have consensus?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
If we don't, then we know that then we need to get to 7, 2, and 5.
Yep.
And if we don't have that quorum, it won't make any difference.
Yep.
That particular meeting.
Mr. Chair and members, in our meetings, it's slightly less formal than a vote, but we've generally used the thumbs up, right? We just make sure everybody's in a good spot. If everybody can show that thumb, then we go ahead and move on to Mr. Gibbs' comment. An observation from the discussion last time, I think that's right. I think the way that this is going to go is it's like building a pyramid. We're going to build a foundation, and then we're going to go to the next level, next level, next level. So we're not all the way up here and then deciding that we didn't make any of the decisions down here. I think it's going to be layered each week that we go.
Okay.
Would,
Neil, you had something more?
would it be a point if it was a strenuous discussion that there might be a minority report? There might be somebody that will say, I would like to be recorded as a no vote. Would that not be appropriate? We still get the number, but one of the 9 people could vote no. If I'm sitting on the city council and looking at the report, I'd like to see who made that, what they were thinking. Is
So-
that inappropriate? to
Well, I
think
think
that way?
one of the interesting things about what we're being asked to do is we're actually being asked to provide options.
Okay.
Okay, and so we're not going to send necessarily, with respect to kind of the final things that we're doing, we're not necessarily going to send one final thing. We're going to have a couple different sets of options that have different prices associated with them. I suppose someone could say, I don't agree with any of those, and I'm going to do that. But I think that I'm framing the question that we're asking is, given a couple different levels of resources that we have available, what's the right mix of stuff that's inside that set of resources? And I think in some respects that makes it a little bit easier to come to consensus than for us having to make some sort of singular recommendation to the council. Because we're not making an ultimate decision on any of this. We're purely advising them on sets of options.
I hope it works out that way.
Yeah. Anything else? Okay, so is there consensus that we're going to include that particular section there? I'm seeing nods around the table. I see some thumbs up here. No one waving their hand or anything like that. Okay, there's a test there. Jamie, on to the next one.
Thank you, committee members. The next two paragraphs are again just reflecting the discussion we had about conduct of the members, and there was specifically a comment that we should not shy away from courageous conversations where inevitably there's going to be some level of conflict, and the whole point of that is that we're agreeing up front that we handle those with respect, and that what we're talking about here are ideas, and it's not personal, and make sure the committee has that understanding going in. There's also at the end there, that last paragraph is just setting the expectation for how members will handle it if somebody feels particularly slighted or aggrieved as a result of the conversation. That it's the responsibility of each of the committee members to work that out with your colleagues and at least make them aware so that there aren't any ill feelings that are being harbored without being raised. And then on the administrative procedures, again, that's just making clear how your project team intends to support you, that the agenda materials will be out the Friday preceding the meeting, unless that meeting actually is on a Friday or Saturday, in which case we'll use the 72-hour standard that's required under state law for public meetings. Okay. The last item at the end of discussion of each topic, I think it's helpful to always be clear about what the follow-up items are, who's being assigned that follow-up, and then at the end of the meetings that we're just being clear about what the next meeting discussion is going to be so that we have some agreement both where we've been and where we're going.
Okay, any discussion on these two?
Excuse me, Chair Pierce, I just have a question about meetings. So
Yeah.
if we have, for example, if we don't have the opportunity to come to a consensus during a meeting and we need to get to the consensus before our next scheduled meeting, is there a way for us to have a meeting that's not currently on the schedule, I guess? Can we add meetings to our agenda is my question, I guess.
I think the answer is that theoretically, yes, we could add meetings. Practically, if we're going to give the public, we're going to already be meeting most of the time on a weekly basis, and if we're going to give the public adequate notice of the meeting, it's going to be difficult to insert a meeting between two meetings in order to make that happen. So I think if we knew 3 weeks from now we were going to have a disagreement and we agreed as a group that we wanted an extra meeting in there, that would be feasible. But I think practically speaking, if we need something decided this week, we're going to have to decide it this week. And part of I think the co-chair is working with the staff is to make sure that as items are coming to the committee to be discussed, that we have an adequate period of time to think about it. And particularly if there are things that are going to be kind of contentious things, that there's the opportunity to lay it over. So we're not sitting on Wednesday making very difficult decisions, and then you're sending me and Neil to the council meeting on the following Monday to go represent them. That's not, we don't want to, but our goal is not to kind of jam it that way in regard to that. And there really isn't another means beyond meetings like this for us to make decisions. So we can't, we have all of city email, but the practicalities of it, the open meeting law prevents us from making decisions that way. So we really need to make sure we're managing stuff from a schedule standpoint. And then as committee members, if what I don't want to have happen is if it's really at the point where we need to make a decision, we need to make sure we've been asking for information that's necessary. So I think it's a disservice to the group in our process if people wait until that meeting to ask for more information, which might have been obvious prior to the meeting. Obviously, if we need more information and we discover during the meeting that we need more, we should ask for it. But I also, people need to be diligent about asking so that we can have the information that we need to make decisions at the meetings. So, Jessica.
Yeah, thinking about that, it is possible to have the department leaders stop by and defend their budget to give us an idea of what really, how they are seeing, what is about their budget that they are so drive through it, so we can have an idea of.
I think we're gonna see every department manager here at the meeting doing exactly that. So, one of the things we have a co-chairs meeting with the staff to talk about kind of upcoming things. And one of the things that we've talked about is how we want to package alternatives. And I don't think it's going to be possible in the committee for us to create 30, 40, 50 different options to be able to say, here's something we can have or not have from a budget perspective. And so I think we're going to ask the staff to create those for us, but we're going to be the decision makers about picking from a menu. So we're not going to be the creators of the menu. I think we'll have input into the menu, but we'll be people picking from the menu to say this is the combination of things that we want. And we'll hear from each of the department chairs for the items in their area. And kind of coming back to the decision-making process that's going to be interesting is that I think as each of the department chairs come through, people are going to have to start keeping lists of things that they want to talk about. But we're going to need at least a decent amount of information from each of the departments before we can start making decisions, because those decisions embody trade-offs. And a good example, like one approach you could take is you could say we're going to go from departments with least property tax support to departments with most property tax support, okay, which would put like the police department at the very end of the list. And if you waited to make a lot of decisions until they came, then the burden might fall heavily on that department. Or if you made decisions early, you might hear something in the police department that you say, that's something that I think we should talk about doing differently, or that we don't need that service. Or in this particular alternative, we don't need it. So I guess that gives you a little bit more color on kind of how I'm thinking about, and Neil has been talking about that as well, about how we're thinking about going about doing that. Other feedback on this? Okay. The one thing that I did want to just comment on the conduct, that was something that was brought up a little bit, is as the committee is meeting, some of the options that we're going to talk about might involve letting people go from the city, because as you've heard the staff talk about, a pretty substantial percentage of the total cost of running the city is related to people costs. And if you're going to make a decent sized impact on the expense side, it necessarily is going to have some impact that falls on people. And it's already falling on people if you listen to what has already taken place for 2020. And so I don't want people to shy away from people conversations, because the very nature of this is that we're going to, if we do our job, there are going to be some impacts that fall on people. But at the same time, I just want to make sure that people are keeping that in mind as they're talking about things, and that we're kind of focusing on services and service choices that we're making, and not have it be too focused on something that could be misinterpreted in terms of kind of people-related conversations. So that's really, in terms of making sure that people are sensitive because there's going to be people who are watching what we're talking about, is that particularly if you're in a department, you're going to come and watch what the department head is talking about, and they'll see what our conversation is. And we just need to be sensitive to knowing that people are watching who will be impacted by the decisions that we're making. So with that, do I hear any other feedback on these two sections? Otherwise, I think we'll do another consensus test here. Is there a consensus with the group that we adopt the charter as written? I see a thumbs up. Anybody? Looks like everybody's okay with it. Okay, that is adopted.
Mr. Chair, we do have a hard copy that we'll ask the committee members to just put your ink to, and once Maureen Failer is able to sign it, we'll make sure everybody gets a copy of that as well. So, thank you.
Moving on then to item number 4.3, which is assessing and property values. Matt, are you going to be talking tonight? I am. Your mic is muted.
Turn your mic on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairs and board members or commission members. I'm going to talk tonight and walk you through kind of assessing 101. I've got multiple parts to the presentation, so I'll pause after the first one to see if there's any questions. I believe in your packet you were emailed out, or you've been able to see a copy of our 2020 report. Our assessment report is out online, as well as the last 5 or 6 years of our assessment report is available out on blm.mn assess. Where I like to start every discussion we have about property assessment is one of the big takeaways is the Minnesota state law property tax timeline is this assessment process is guided by the state of Minnesota through the Constitution and lots of different statutory language on how this process works. The one big takeaway from it is that it's a multi-year process, and so what's illustrated on the screen right now is the timeline for the 2020 assessment for taxes payable in 2021. So if I can just focus your attention here, I like to orientate where we're at. So it's June of 2020. We have sent out our valuation notices in March of this year for 2020. Our appraisal date that we are working off of is January 2nd, 2020. What's of note here is that the values that we determine as of January 2nd, 2020 are based off of sales that have occurred anywhere from 3 months to 15 months earlier. So our sales study period was for October of 2018 through September 2019. Those sales get trended forward for market conditions and then applied to our properties through our rate structure to come up with our values for 2020. The process from there is, as I mentioned, in March we send out the notices. There are 2 different avenues of appeal at the local level. There's actually technically 3 at the local level. The first one is to contact the assessor, ask questions. The second one is after asking those questions and you would like to appeal your value, you can go through our local board of appeal process. The city of Bloomington does have a appointed local board of appeal and equalization. City council does appoint those board members. There's 5 of them. They each have specialty in real estate. 2 of them are versed in commercial real estate. So they serve the city council to hear the local appeals at the local level. If you feel like you haven't gotten your appeal heard at the local board, you have the option to go to the county board of appeal, and that meets the last 2 weeks in June, and in fact it has just wrapped up. From there, what's not on this particular timeline is the next piece of the puzzle, which is the preliminary levy that's set by the city council, school districts, and the county in September and then ratified in December. Based off of the levy discussion in September and our values that we've determined in 2020, January of 20, that sets the property tax rate, and we send out a truth in taxation notice in November of each year, and then there's a TNT hearing or the tax levy hearing in December to talk about property tax impacts. And in December is also when the city does pass their final levy adoption. From that point, then, final tax rates are determined, and the property tax statements then can be figured out and mailed, and that's when those are sent in March of each year, and the property tax payments are May 15th and October 15th. So, bringing it back, when we start talking about property tax impacts and valuation and the discussion we're going to have about future years and what's going on in the local real estate market, the big takeaway here is that this is a multi-year process, and the moment that we transition from one assessment cycle to the next, we're already today analyzing sales that will be utilized for the 2021 assessment. So that cycle just continues to repeat itself. It's also very important for everybody to understand that in Minnesota, taxing jurisdictions, the city, county, and school districts, they set a property tax dollar or a levy amount. This is different than some other states that have a mill rate where you just set a like an income tax or a sales tax rate, and whatever your value is, that's your share. It's different in Minnesota. The county, school district, and the city, they set levies, their need basically, and then your property value sets your proportional share of the jurisdiction's tax dollars need. So it's important to understand that the two pieces, that levy and our assessment, sets the rate. The rate isn't set predeterminately. There's a lot of different factors that impact property taxes, and one of the biggest ones is the state of Minnesota does have a tax classification system. In it, and I have a slide here shortly to kind of show a couple of them, there are 56 different tax classifications in Minnesota. This is how the legislature is able to determine which classes of property pay what and what levels of property tax. There's also other laws like fiscal disparities that impact property taxes. And then the homestead market value exclusion program was redone in 2013. That also impacts property value or property taxes. And then just the changes within the property classification. So changes in commercial versus residential versus multifamily, all of that plays a part in how property taxes are determined. And then lastly is the levy amount set by the county, school, and city. This slide shows just a snippet. Again, there's 56 or so, and this is about a quarter of the page, and I highlighted a couple of them that are very important to Bloomington. The first one is residential homestead. In Minnesota, the first $500,000 of market value has a class rate of 1%. So you pay the percent of your market value that's available for taxation in Minnesota for residential homestead is 1%. So if you have a $250,000 home, then that means $2,500 roughly is available for taxation. It's a metric that they use. So everybody's property value gets turned into tax capacity, and that's where the rates that get figured out get applied to. Something to note is that in Minnesota for commercial property, the first 100,000 is at 1.5%. Anything between 100 and 150,000 is at 1.5, but they pay the state general rate. And over 150,000 is at 2%, and it also pays the state general rate at that rate. One of the things that we're going to talk about later in the presentation is multifamily apartments, and multifamily pays the value is at 1.25%. So again, a long list of different rates, but these are all set by the state of Minnesota. Market value homestead exclusion. So this is the homestead benefit, and I always like to explain how this works. So in Minnesota, for the first $76,000 of property value, the maximum benefit is $30,400. So if you have a home or a condo or something that's valued at $76,000, you only pay on the difference between $76,000 and $30,400. Once your value increases from $76,000, the benefit actually declines at a 9% rate, and so it zeroes out at $413,800. And so the takeaway here is, if you have a homesteaded market or a homesteaded house, when your value increases, your exclusion amount can decrease, which means your taxable market value actually increases faster than your value. So that can be confusing. And what I like to say is that anytime the state legislature goes and puts an exclusion or an exemption or some other, or they tinker sometimes with the classification rates, all that does is push down on the balloon and it pops out somewhere else. And so excluding tax base, which is the market value homestead exclusion, what that does is it creates shifts. So just a quick overview of what happened for 2020. The city has a total market value now of $14.6 billion. That is the third or fourth year in a row of kind of a record high value. It's up about 2.5%. And if you notice, residential was up about 1%. We have a little over $8 billion of residential value. 2.4% commercial was up, a little over $4 billion of commercial, another $815 million in industrial. That was up about 5.6%. And apartments were up to $1.6 billion, 9.6% increase over last year. Of that, there's a significant amount of new construction for 2020. So I guess I focus on this last column. This is the net effect of the property tax change, not including new construction. So really, it was a fairly balanced year. Outside of apartments, did have a slightly higher increase than the other property components. One of the things that we've done over the years, and it's because, and I have a slide on it next, it's because the city of Bloomington's tax base is fairly unique in that half of the, actually I'll step back 1 second here. So if we look at commercial, $4 billion of market value, and we think about that 2% rate versus the 1% rate on residential, that when we convert commercial value to tax capacity, what it does is it basically equals the amount, it actually exceeds the amount that residential pays as a share of our tax base. And so that's how we get over 50% or right around 50% for our commercial industrial tax base. When we look at the last kind of 15 years, there's a lot of data here, but we model it because during different time periods, like 2008, where we had a significant increase in commercial value and not so much in residential, that can create shifts between commercial and residential. And so it's important to note through history that we have had multiple years where there are some shifts. 2021, or Pay 2021, the one that's kind of being focused on right now, is not going to be one of those years. It's fairly balanced. For Pay 20, though, which residents have just experienced, residential property value increased on average about 9%. And when we start talking about the median value home, that was closer to a 10.5% increase. So that's the value somewhere right around $280,000. And so when we talk about shifts, who pays what portion, in 2020, we did see a higher percentage of residential properties pick up more of that share. And so it's important, and we'll probably, with questions, revert back to this slide to talk about different time periods. This slide here shows that genetic makeup of our diverse tax base. The green here is commercial and industrial combined, and for Pay 21, it's at 50%. For single-family residential, it was at a high of 50% back in 2006, 2007, and then once property values started to decline, it actually declined all the way to 38%. And it's kind of stayed relatively the same ever since. One item to note here is the multifamily market. As we've built a lot of new supply and there's a lot of demand for multifamily residential, that segment of the market has picked up a larger piece of the share in the most recent years. So the one thing about our 50% commercial industrial percentage is it's unique. When we look at our peer cities and the cities that surround us, 50% is the most by almost 10%. City of Rochester has 41.7%, but the better part of the suburbs are all in that 30% range. And so when you have shifts in commercial and industrial and residential values, they ebb and flow. It affects the Bloomington taxpayer more when you have drastic changes. And one of the big things that we're looking at right now as we try to look forward into the future of our commercial industrial tax base, about 31% of it's in retail. A little over $1.5 billion of our value is in retail. And that includes, obviously, Mall of America, Southtown Shopping Center, Valley West. This is, this is restaurants. This is fast food. All of that's included in retail. Another 29% of it is in office. And the other big chunk of our tax base, 15% of it is in hospitality. And so when we start looking into the future, trying to predict what's going to happen for 21 assessment, we're starting, there's a lot of headwinds in retail, a lot of headwinds in hospitality. And so trying to figure out how those particular markets will behave going forward is anybody's guess. But, right now it is struggling mightily. Anytime I do a presentation on property taxes, I put in a plug for a program that is not widely used. This is the Minnesota Homestead Credit Refund and the Renter's Property Tax Refund. This program is for both homeowners and renters, and it has to be your principal place of residence. And in 2013, they greatly enhanced the program. There's more people that qualify. And so there's two types. One is the regular property tax refund. That is based on household income. And for multifamily, that cap is $62,340, and for homeowner, it's $115,020. And then the special property tax refund, which is known as kind of the circuit breaker, that is where if your taxes have increased more than 12% in any given year and at least $100, you can get a portion of your property taxes back as part of your income tax filing. This next chart we've just added as part of the discussion. The rental side here, as Faith and I have been chatting the last couple days on some multifamily stuff, we took a deeper dive into that. But first, let's take a look at the median value home. In 2019, the median value was $283,900 for a total property tax. This is city, county, and school district combined of just under $3,600. If in this chart runs off of the adjusted gross income plus any non-taxable income, but for I believe the median household income in the city of Bloomington is in that $70,000 to $80,000 range. It's somewhere in here. I think it's high 70s. But for the typical homeowner owning the median value home and filing joint property taxes, if you have a family income of about $80,000, talk to your accountant. You could get as much as 30% back on the income tax side. And then one of the newest pieces that we've added, and we're still trying to understand how this side of the program works, but what we did is through market advisors and tracking some of their average monthly rent, and I have more of that data going forward. But the average rent in Bloomington for 2019 was a little under $1,200, and so they actually get credit for 17% of that rent. That rent amount on an annual basis is a little over $14,000, and so that's a little over $2,400 that they could get back on income taxes. And the cap is at $62,340. So depending on where your household income would be, that is something else that can be looked at. And it's, as I talk to folks over at Department of Revenue, this is one of the most underutilized programs that the state of Minnesota has. And so I always want to emphasize how important this is. And with that, Jamie, I think if there's any questions on anything that I've presented thus far, before we kind of get into a little bit more of our impact modeling, I'd pause there for any questions or clarifications.
Any questions? Neil?
Matt, maybe you'll talk about it when you get into modeling, but the first thing that pops in my head is, and I know that the attorneys out there who challenge tax valuations because the hotel's not full, the retail is not operating, the industrials are vacating, are already sharpening their blades to come in and protest those assessments. When does that impact hit us? If they start with your 20 or 21 assessments, how long before we end up in tax court and we end up having to rebate based on their lack of income or
Sure. Mr. Chair and I guess Mr. Chair, you know, it's interesting the way this pandemic has hit. It's hit right kind of in the middle of our assessment cycle. And, you know, Mayor Busey asked me this question a few weeks ago at City Council. And, you know, we set our 2020 assessment was set, you know, as of January 2nd, 2020. And so anything COVID related certainly wasn't known at that point. But for property tax, for tax court filings, you know, commercial property actually has until April 30th of 2021 to file an appeal on their 2020 value. So they have quite a bit of time. The question is, you know, what was known at the time of that assessment, and what, and make no mistake about it, 2020 is going to be a really rocky year. The good news is from at least tax court mitigation, and kind of the efforts we're working on today in my shop is trying to understand where the market's going for 21 and making sure that we get that assessment correct so that we don't have a lot of tax court litigation for pay 22. And so it's about the timeline. But you're right. There will definitely be an uptick in filings, whether it's you know, warranted or not. But we're certainly preparing for that as we speak.
Follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you're beginning to pro forma those now? Because that can have a dramatic impact on revenue stream in 21, 22, 23.
Yeah, we're and some of it is in the rest of the presentation, but not to the degree of what your question asks. We are, you know, we're consuming STAR report data to understand how the hospitality industry is hurting. Obviously, we're tracking retail sales and trying to figure out how that's working. Something as simple as you know, social distancing and work from home and how that impacts the office market. My staff, to be kind of blunt, once we booked the 2020 assessment and got through the local appeal process, we pivoted right into kind of our recession modeling so that we're spending a good 9 months trying to understand how the commercial market will be impacted. We're also taking a look, and you point out that the commercial market is going to have some challenges going forward. At the same time, and what my next steps of the presentation is going to show, there's still a lot of tailwinds in the single family and multifamily market, and so that those two things combined will set up a shift for the 21 assessment pay 22.
Thank you.
So before we move off this slide, there's one thing I want to point out on here, and that is kind of how the work of this committee integrates with the schedule that's up there. And Matt was pointing at that unlabeled September date there, which is that preliminary levy. So one of our deliverables, in fact, it's really our first deliverable to the city council, is to make a recommendation to the council on how they should set that maximum levy. Okay, and we're going to have to do that without having gone through the expense side of things, probably as part of developing our scenarios for the revenue side of things. So that's how that particular recommendation integrates in. And then the second set of recommendations, which are the options that we're going to be providing the city council, those really need to land at the city council kind of around the kind of middle of November in the calendar there, because that gives them time to consider them. And I believe that the budget schedule that we talked about, and I'll look at Kari to see if she nods or shakes her head. I think the budget schedule is we were looking to land a budget conversation so the council could make a decision at that first meeting in December. Was that the right one? Oh, I'm seeing a nod. I'm remembering this right now. So just from thinking about how our work fits in, because this calendar here isn't just the assessment calendar, it's also showing how our work fits into the process. So any other questions for Matt before he goes on and start talking about the modeling that they're doing? Not seeing any questions. Why don't you go on, Matt?
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're going to just kind of touch on some modeling, some of the things that we work on. But one of the number one questions we get is, why look at the median value home? And so we're going to touch on that, and then I'm going to go through some of the different modeling information that we know today, and what we're trying to make some determinations on as we go forward. So the median value history. So just from a pure statistical standpoint or a measure of central tendency, the median value is that point where half of the homes in Bloomington are valued higher than, and half of the homes in Bloomington are valued less than. The median value home doesn't actually exist. It's kind of fictional. It's a measure, and we can track it over time. One of the things that you'll notice looking through history, pay 2000, or this is actually an assessment year. So for the 2007 assessment year, our median value was at 247.9. It trended downward for about 6 years in a row, and it bottomed out at 188,000. It took 4 years to climb back to 246,400. So basically from 07 to 2017, we lost a whole decade of value. We had a slight growth in 18 and a substantial growth in 19. And I've got some charts here to kind of show you why that happened. And then another kind of a slight uptick here for 2020. So that value for 2020, I'll skip back because I forgot what it is. It's 286.4. And so just kind of showing in a graphical form, where does 286.4 show up? So this is our 21,000, and this is out of the assessment report, 21,000 homes in the city of Bloomington. We have the majority of the homes here in the 250 to 300,000 category, and 286 lines up somewhere in here. So this is where the median lies. One of the items to note is we track this data on an annual basis, and we're starting to lose homes. We have less than 800 homes valued below 200,000. Likewise, we don't have much more than 375 homes valued over 600,000. So that's just the genetic makeup of the Bloomington housing stock, and why the median value has statistical representation for the city of Bloomington. Again, if we just look at it from a percent change aspect, a little over 9,000 homes saw a 0 to 3% increase for 2020, and another call it 8,000 homes had anywhere from a minus 3% change to a 6% increase. but that's the predominantly the housing stock. And then just looking at it as a market value by stratified by the value, again, the median was somewhere around just under 1%, roughly. And here's where you actually will notice the bifurcation or the trifurcation actually in our market. Anything under 200 and anything under 200,000, which are those 800 homes, they did see 6% and upwards of an 8% increase. There's such a demand for affordable housing that market just continues to increase. And last year, if I showed you a chart that looks just like this, the median was about 9%. And going back, this was probably closer to 15 and 20% increases in these lower tiered pricing of homes. So where does the median value home sit? This chart shows there's about 3,500 homes on here that are illustrated, and they're within 5% of the median value. So that 286,000. That's about a $14,000 deviation from 286. They're located all over Bloomington. If I expand it out a little bit more and say, plus or minus 10%, it gives you a pretty good picture of where the median value home is. It's all over Bloomington. So when we start modeling, especially on a forward look, we have two pieces of data that we can look at. We can look at our sales that are coming in, and we can do assessment ratios where we actually compare our assessed value to what it sold for, and we do that look. And we also will take a look at what how the median value home tracks with MLS data. And so what's in the green line is the median value home. Again, 286 all the way over here. And then the blue line is the median sale price as reported through MLS. And we have access to MLS data, and InfoSparks is the big tool that we use here. The boxes are kind of interesting highlights. It's the inflection point of where the median value home and the median sale price meets. And one of the interesting pieces, and the reason why I touch on it, is when it happened in 2007, the market declined. When it happened in 2012, the market drastically increased. When it happened in 2019, I was asking myself, which way is the market going to go? And the market, I think, is going to continue to increase. But it gives you pause as to when you see that happen, where is the market heading? And I got a lot more slides here to share with you on where we're at. So all of the rest of this data comes from our friends at North Star MLS and using their InfoSparks tool. This is a good 15-year look. I like to go back 15 years to look at what January of 2000 or what 2005, 2006, 2007 looked like when comparing where we're at today. So this chart is the number of homes that are for sale. Today, there's 128 homes. This is condos, townhouses, and single family. This isn't just single family houses. 128 homes. In a normal market, we should have between 500 and 600. If you remember, the recession hit kind of in the late 07, 08 in the housing market, and you can kind of see the number of homes we had on the market during that time period. If I dive in a little closer, and we're going to do this a couple times, I'm going to show you a larger picture, and then we're going to dive in and take a look at new home listings by month. And this is really where COVID-19 starts to show up. In April of 2020, we had about a 50% decline in new listings. And for the year, we're down about 20%. So not only do we have we were in an undersupplied state, but now we actually have that exacerbated with this pandemic, that there's less homes available on the market. When May data came in, we're still 27% down. And so come July 1, we'll start having some information on June, and we're going to continue to track that. But so supply is down 20%. What I can show you here is this is closed sales, and this is a rolling 12-month average. And what's important here is that we've on average going way back about 12 to 1,300 homes that transact every year. We're still doing that today, even though there's not as many homes available and we're in an undersupplied state. Demand is still there. We're still transacting 12 to 1,300 homes since 2016. That bottomed out at 700 in July of 11. If we take a closer look at what COVID has done, we can see that March our sales were pretty steady. April we were actually down 10%, but we were higher than we were in 18. But you can kind of see now for May of 2020 we're down 50%. That's probably due to, a lot of it is due to a shortened supply. But so, the verdict's out. We're going to continue to monitor it as June data comes in to see what we have for property transactions. And then this chart kind of ties those two supply-demand metrics together. Normal equilibrium is about 5 to 6 months of supply today, and we've been running less than 2 months of supply all the way since 2016. So we're still in a supply shortage, and what I like to say is, we're probably undersupplied by a factor of 5 or 6. And so what I'm trying to model and wrap my head around is the effects of COVID. If demand decreased in half, my thought process on that is we're still undersupplied by a factor of 2 to 2.5 times. So as we continue to model this data, number of days on market, 12 days is the typical home. So this is the typical days on market today. I have a number of colleagues and friends that are in the real estate sales side on residential, and they told me a story that their marketing right now is, they list a home on a Thursday, and by Sunday evening they're asking for all qualified offers, and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday they're looking for the next homes to list for a Thursday, and they just kind of repeat that. It's just how quickly. And what I will say is that there's 17, 18, 19 showings on these homes within those 12 days. Percentage of asking price is another measure. Right now we're at 101.4% for May of 2020. We've been at or near 100% in the summer months all the way back to 14, but there's been a number of months through 18 and 19 that we were above 100% ask. And then the one that I think is going to have the most dramatic impact on real estate pricing as we continue to go forward is the fact that 30-year interest rates are below historic record level. October of 2017, 30-year interest rate hit 3.44. That was the lowest on record. What's really interesting is in November of 18, we hit 4.87%, and then we've declined since then down to 3.13. Just taking a little bit closer look, and there's a lot of data on this slide, and I understand that. But the two takeaways is interest rates are about 20% less than they were a year ago. And they're at historic lows. But what's equally important as I model this data is the direction that interest rates are trending. So if you're in a declining interest rate market, that usually promotes price appreciation. If you're in an increasing interest rate market, that usually flattens pricing. And you can see it in the data when I told you that when we set the 2019 assessment, and you think back to that timeline, In 2017, when we were analyzing all of those sales, we're in a declining interest rate environment. And in 18, we were in a increasing interest rate environment, and lo and behold, our values that we set in 2020 were relatively flat. I had some conversations with Jamie prior to COVID, so January, February timeframe, when I started seeing interest rates decline as drastically as they did, and I was already telling him that we're probably going to see another year like 2019 in appreciating residential real estate. So we're going to continue to monitor it, but so far all indications is that the single-family residential market is still showing signs of appreciation. And then we jump over into the multifamily market. Am I doing on time?
You're getting long.
Bit long?
You're getting long.
Okay. So I'm almost done on the multifamily side. So one of the things that I again, taking a longer look at this. So this is this is market rent over the last 15, or actually this is a longer period, 25 years. Vacancy rates, kind of like interest rates, when vacancy rates increase, rental rates decrease, or flatten, sorry. When vacancy rates decrease, rental rates increase. Equilibrium for for apartments is about 5% vacancy, and we've been in an interest rate environment over the last 10 years that are below 5%. We're going to touch on this with some of Faith's information later, and we'll come back to this slide. Just a quick another look at that same set of data, but just in a 5-year increment. And what I tell you is that from 2000 to 2010, we saw a little over $100 increase in market rent. And from 2010 to 2020, we've seen upwards of 50 to 60% increases in market rent. What's different about where we're at today, and this is important, is in 2000, the early 2000s, there was a trend of folks leaving multifamily real estate and going into home ownership. That's when home ownership rates hit about 70%. The foreclosure crisis and the subprime hit. People exited single family and went into multifamily real estate. That shows up here in this data, increasing vacancy rates, and then the sharp decline in vacancy rates, and then we've been playing catch up ever since on the supply side. Bringing it into just Bloomington, the average rent over the last few years, the one anomaly is in 2018 or 17 to 18. City of Bloomington added about little over 2,000 units during this time frame. And so vacancy rates increased, and again you can see that rental rates flattened. We had about an 8%, and it was reported in the newspaper, about an 8% increase in rent for 2019. And we're still in what I like to pair this data with the single family data and basically say, this is where I believe that we're in that housing crisis, and it's hard to find a place to rent, and it's hard to find a place to purchase a home. And so, bringing it back, what we know is that the multifamily and the single family markets seem to still have a lot of air in, and that it's got some appreciation in it, coupled with the fact that 75% of our commercial property is showing significant signs of weakness. So those two together will make 21 a challenging time and will impact shifts in property taxes for pay 2022. So that's kind of what I've got on the modeling aspect.
A lot of numbers.
It is a lot of
Reminds me when I meet with the data scientists at work. You just, like, oh my gosh, what to think about here. But I think the key takeaway, and this is something that we've talked about a little bit, and I think Matt's presentation kind of brings it home, is kind of our charge is to really try to consider both kind of 21 and 22 kind of revenue picture and make a call on what we want to do about that. And what Matt talked about is that the valuation side of the property tax situation for 21 is pretty much settled at this point. There's a little bit of appeal going on, but largely we know what the values are and what the proportion is going to be paid by single family, what's going to be paid by multifamily, and what's going to be paid by commercial. What we don't know is how that's going to pan out in 2022. And one of the questions that we're eventually going to get around to asking is for taxes payable in 2022, do we want to say, like, let's say we adopted the posture that that the tax paid by the median value home would be constant from 21 to 22. If we adopted that as a posture, and we saw a big move in the commercial industrial down, what that would mean is that would necessarily mean that the total amount of tax collected by the city would go down pretty substantially. Okay. We could, and there's a bunch of different positions that we can take in that. And so I think we're going to be hearing more from Matt as he's doing his modeling here. But this question of, for fiscal 22, how is that going to pan out, is going to be one of the key things that we need to decide. And we also have the option to, for example, in our recommendations for fiscal 21, to generate revenue in fiscal 21 that could be used in fiscal 22. That's another option that we have. Ordinarily, you try to not think about things like that and say, we're going to have 21 pay for 21 and we're going to have 22 pay for 22. But in your personal life, if you know that next year there's only going to be one person working in the family and that person could be working extra this year, you might work extra this year and set some money aside for next year. So that's potentially within the set of options that we have to consider. So we'll open it up here for a little bit. Can you give me an idea of what the remaining time requirement is so I can set the time here?
Committee members, I don't think we have a hard stop time. We were using 8:30 as a guideline for the first couple of meetings just because it was a lot of information and I didn't want to overburden everybody. But as long as you're feeling value in the conversation, I don't think that we need to be restricted by an arbitrary timeline.
Okay. I'll open it up then for questions for Matt. Go ahead.
Matt, or Councilman, or Chair, sorry. You might get to this in your next bit of your presentation, but I have a question about incentive programs and if any incentive programs exist for properties on the commercial side. And by that, I mean, maybe there's like a tax, excuse me, I'm not sure what type of incentive programs, but maybe there's some type of incentive to come and have a business in Bloomington, so we'll give you some type of discount or whatever it is related to your property. I'm not sure. So that's my question that may or may not get touched on in your next bit.
So, Mr. Chair and Commissioner, I apologize, I can't read your name from here.
Sorry.
Azari. There is, through the property tax system, there is not. Through the structure in which the property tax system, there is not. I know the city is looking at different, alternative incentives or small business loans or that type of thing. I don't have the details on that, but through the property tax system, no.
Okay.
Other questions? John?
I just make an observation. This was quite helpful to me. And taking a look at this data, obviously there's the big disparity. One of the big stories is that slide that's right up there with 75% in those three rather volatile, somewhat arguably distressed, buckets. But I was looking at the residential, sort of categories, and one of Matt's slides showed that the higher valued home groups largely going down, probably the top half dozen in size were going down. And I was looking at the slide that showed these sort of by neighborhood, if you will, and looking at Highwood and Auto Club and Jefferson and some of those groups, 19 to 20, going down in value, and thinking about these disparities. We've got certainly some buckets and categories going up, and maybe there's some trends. It strikes me, though, when you talk about 22 and out a little bit of distance, at some point in the conversation, it strikes me worthy of thinking about where are the values going in those high tax generating, if you will, valuations, and thinking about Bloomington relative to the quote competitors, if you will, for the price values. And I'm not sure which communities are the competitors to the Auto Clubs and the Jeffersons and the Highwoods, et cetera. But a competition indeed it is, and a net of that is how much property tax revenue comes to our city. It strikes me, and it really jumped out at me, maybe more than it has traditionally, that we've got some categories that are going the direction that nets us less revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Was that in the form of a question, or was that more of a comment?
Something I think I'd love to have us explore as we start looking not at 21 but 22 and deeper, and maybe the signal the city might send to folks that are considering Bloomington as opposed to Minnetonka, Eden Prairie, Edina, Burnsville, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And I think, in my neighborhood, which has homes with a variety of prices in it, I know there was a very large house that didn't sell for a particularly large amount of money on a per square foot basis. And in talking to people, there was at least one realtor that I talked to said that the demand for people who want really kind of just really big houses isn't as strong as it used to be. And so I think there's some shifting in kind of what people want. I think also if you look at just the amount of multifamily in the city and the demand for that, there's clearly been a big change in people's desire to own something, or maybe its ability to own something, versus their ability to rent something, that you're seeing particularly in the demand for new residential in the city. So
yeah, I noticed that, but the data doesn't necessarily bear that out when you bring it into the aggregate.
yeah,
Where we saw valuations go up, and we certainly saw in certain valuations substantial increases in value, which suggests to me demand, and then yet diminishment of value in some other categories, which might be reflective of the overall metro area, or might just be reflective of us here. And I think it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, I guess one question is part of this that at the more modestly priced house range, that we're just seeing the lack of creation of that kind of property in the metro area, and that there's just more demand for sub $300,000 housing all up in the metro area that people can afford versus what's available.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and board members. So two comments. One is when you look at the value loss for that call it that $500,000 home, it didn't lose as much value through time, and it didn't gain the value back, versus the median that went from 247 down to 188 and then back up. A lot of that had to do with the foreclosure crisis hit that priced home. There was a lot of discussion back in 2008 and 9 of the home ownership percentage reaching 70%, and was that just too high? And then predatory lending issues that happened, and then so a lot of that hit that segment of the market. And then coming back around right now, it's the value proposition is spending in the city of Bloomington $1,200 for rent, or can you go out and buy a home even at $300,000 and have those numbers work out so that you actually can save money by purchasing real estate? And so that is a value proposition that's being had right now, especially with interest rates as low as they are.
Neil.
But given the tax base and the slide you have up there right now, the 900-pound gorilla is the fact that the commercial property values are really taking a hit right now. The residential, you said, is paid very stable.
Mhm.
But this is the one that's really going to cause the problem in our future revenue. Because a lot of those retail and office tenants are simply refusing to pay their tax portions and pay their common area maintenance because they're not in the buildings, their employees aren't there, and they're just telling the landlords, we're not going to pay. And so those valuations and the collections in this segment of our value, which has been a blessing for all these years, is also going to come back to bite us. And we're really going to have to deal with those numbers because they are not, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, but they are not going to be anything close to what we've experienced.
Mr. Chair.
Tell me I'm wrong.
No, Mr. Chair, members of the board, I wish I could tell you that you were wrong. I mean, the verdict's out. Mr. Peterson, you understand commercial real estate, and the issue that, from a valuation standpoint is when you start looking at, the value into perpetuity, and when does the value come back? And yes, there's going to be definitely a discount. But if somebody's going to purchase real estate in 2021, when we have to set the assessment, the question they're going to be asking themselves is, when is the economy? When is my lodging revenue? When are those retail sales going to come back? Are we 6 months out? Are we a year out? Are we 3 years out to getting back to stability? And then that's just a present value calc. And so, we're gonna know a lot more in the next 6 months on how real estate's going to be priced and how value is going to be determined. But it is difficult right now because if I'm looking at a crystal ball, I'm seeing some aspects of lodging being 2 years out to 5 years out to recovery. It's anybody's guess. We don't know what next week will bring with the pandemic, let alone will school start on time? So there's a lot of unknowns in this modeling prospect, and we're trying to do 3 different scenarios. I would call it a best case, our best guess, and kind of more of a long recovery. So trying to model a lot of these different things.
Just a follow-up comment.
Yeah.
You're held in very high esteem within the profession, Matt. And so I'm glad you're on our side, and I trust the information you'll bring us. I trust we will listen to it.
John?
Totally agree with that point. It's just sort of a colloquy here, though, if we could for a second. I know this is embryonic, given what we've just been through. We're not through it yet, but you mentioned, Matt, we don't know when we'll be through this recession and the like. I think we'll all agree that probably we'll be through it at some point. But do you, by chance, I don't know if it's the Green Street folks or others, do you have consultants on the team now yet that are giving us any sort of early sense of when we're through a recession, what these particular sectors look like? And the foundation for that question in my mind is, I think about my office and how much space we're going to need at my company for the offices that look a lot like the ones along 494, and when these leases expire, it's going to be a fraction. Mm-hmm. And I think about the last business I was in, where virtually all we had as physical assets were offices, and I think about where they'll be. So that's office. And then I think about a piece of our business which is to enable e-commerce, and I think about how people are buying things and where they're going, and maybe not just because of state orders. I can envision a recovery that nonetheless has substantially less physical retail, site-based retail, office space, hospitality, conventions. I know that people would be guessing to some degree, but do we have online consultants that are trying to give us a sense of that one yet? Or what do we do?
Yes, and yes.
Hey, there we go.
Yeah. Even the firm you mentioned, we're working with to understand the different various REIT markets, especially mall REITs. And
Will you
understand-
define REIT, please?
real estate investment trusts. So these are what investors are investing in all over the country. So yeah, between Green Street Advisors, we do have a subscription. We're working with them. There are a number of others that we've tapped into. As I mentioned earlier, the moment we booked the 2020 assessment, we turned our staff loose into really understanding what's happening going forward. And it's diving into the intricate details of each one of those property segments. So we're working on it, and yes, and yes.
Thank you.
I continue to ask Jamie for subscription dollars on different things, and
I can verify that.
because it is so important to Bloomington.
Chairs and committee members, if you're okay, let's continue with the agenda. And if you do have additional questions, why don't you write them down? We'll get them at the end of the meeting. But the point of having this conversation tonight was very intentional, and it's to help you gain a stronger understanding of how the property valuation system works here. And what we're going to come back to is how it interacts with the tax levy decisions that we make. So, the information that Matt shared about what we call the hydraulics between the residential and the commercial property values from year to year ends up affecting how the tax levy gets spread amongst those different property classifications. So as we're looking ahead, we can give a pretty good sense of who's going to bear more or less of the burden in a tax levy from year to year based on how the different classifications are moving in value. So as you go back and you look at this, just kind of keep that in mind, but I also really want you to ask as many questions as you need to get a good understanding of this. One of the resources that's on your committee website is the assessing report that Matt and his team put together. There's a ton of really good information in there to help you understand a lot more. So I'd strongly encourage when you're bored on some weekend that you pick up that scintillating document. That'll cure your boredom, and it will enlighten you greatly. So with that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So we'll, unless there's an objection, we'll leave a little bit of time at the end to get any other questions out. Otherwise, I will move on in the agenda to the racial equity item number 4.4. Faith Jackson.
You want to move your microphone in there too?
Yeah.
Thank you. So as mentioned, my name is Faith Jackson, and I am the city's racial equity coordinator. And so my presentation here today is about how we center racial equity in these budget considerations. And so before I jump into the presentation, I just want to acknowledge a few things. So one, I come from a long line of teachers. I also teach Sunday school, and so a lot of my presentations are call and response. So I may ask for a show of hands sometimes, and at the end of this presentation, I'm going to ask for volunteers. So just so you know, be prepared. I may call on you. And then the other thing that I want to acknowledge is that I'm still trying to memorize names of the committee. And so if you do have questions for me, when you offer that question, just let me know your name, for its first or last name, and then I'll just use that to respond and acknowledge you moving forward. So let's jump into the presentation here. The goal of this presentation today is for you to be able to walk away with the ability to really identify how the potential impacts of your proposed budget changes, where applicable, how they impact Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so you'll hear me say throughout this presentation BIPOC as an acronym, and that acronym stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so really looking at how those communities may be impacted by some of the budget considerations that you have to make, and then also identify the strategies that's needed in order to mitigate any sort of adverse impacts. So I'll start off my presentation to you with just a little bit of information about how racial equity has evolved in the city of Bloomington, and then we'll look at information that describes government's role in creating racial inequities and disparities, and spend some time just looking at what racial disparities we are aware of in the city of Bloomington. And then we'll spend the second half of the presentation, and really the bulk of the presentation today, doing some modeling. And so we'll have an opportunity to do sort of an activity together where we'll discuss the tools that you can use to center racial equity, and then we'll have an opportunity to explore that. And so I will spend about 10 to 15 minutes really doing the background information about racial equity. I'll breeze through some of that so that we can get into the modeling aspects of it. But I just want to acknowledge that information is important. I know some of you have heard it before, and all of the information will be in a PowerPoint. And feel free to reach out to me if you have questions or if any of the information that I share in terms of terminology or history is new information for you. So racial equity in the city of Bloomington. Equity and inclusion is a strategic priority. And about 5 years ago, the city of Bloomington became more intentional about how we move forward in this work. We've had 2 groups of staff who participate in programs with GARE, which is the Government Alliance on Racial Equity. And then in December of 2017, the City Council adopted a racial equity vision statement. And so that vision statement just says that the city is going to act courageously in advancing racial equity, and we want to be a place that is vibrant, safe, and healthy, where people of all races thrive. After some time of doing racial equity work, there was a decision to be made about how this work would continue. And the council and administrators decided that they wanted to hire someone to really lead this work in a full-time way. And so in October 7th, I believe, I started in this position as the racial equity coordinator. And my job is to integrate the principles of racial equity throughout all the programs, services, and practices in the city of Bloomington. So I have lots of free time. Why do we prioritize racial equity? So I mentioned that equity and inclusion is a strategic priority, and those pillars, equity and inclusion, aren't exclusive to race and racial equity. But we prioritize racial equity here in the city of Bloomington for several reasons, and I'll go through some of those here. One, we prioritize racial equity because the creation and perpetuation of racial inequities has really been baked into government. And race in itself, right, as a social construct was something that was created and perpetuated by government. And so for those reasons, because government has been a critical actor in creating racial inequities and racial disparities, we prioritize that in government work. Also, we know in order to have sort of a maximum impact, focus and really centering in on what's important is necessary, right? And so the idea that a one-size-fits-all model will work, we know that's not true. Oftentimes when I'm doing presentations to staff, I talk about how I like to work late night. And sometimes when I'm working late night, there's these commercials about all these products that you need. And I'm like, oh, that looks like it'll fit me. And then I order it and I say one size fits all. And I get it and either I can't get in it or it's way too big, right? And so both in a practical sense, we know that this idea that one size fits all doesn't work. And so when we're doing the work of racial equity, it's important that we be intentional and really focus in on race and prioritize race. Also, we know that a focus on racial equity is important if we want to get to different outcomes. And so for the last 50 years or so, as a society, we've determined that we wanted to move away from some of the things, policies and practices that we had in place before and move towards a better society. And even in doing that, we see that there's still a lot of work to be done. And so if we want to really move the work forward, we have to be intentional about what we're doing. And then lastly, in prioritizing race, that doesn't mean that other areas of equity and inclusion are excluded, right? So it's race and, not race only. So now we'll talk a little bit about government's role in creating racial inequities and disparities. And so when I say the term racial inequities and institutional racism and racial disparities, by a show of hands, who feels fairly confident that they understand what those things mean? Okay, yes, you can participate too. And so I'll just spend a little bit of time here really diving deep into what that means. And so when I say racial inequities, those are government-sponsored legislation, policies, practices, laws, etc., that have discriminated against or disenfranchised people based on race, right? And so think about explicit legislation or laws, right, that sort of limited what people can do because of their race. Now, institutional racism is the systematic distribution of resources, and power and opportunity in our society to the benefit of people who are white and the exclusion of people who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so there's the law, right, that was sort of explicitly racist for a significant portion of our history in this country. And then there was the system. And so people who sort of enacted those laws and sort of the society that upheld that. And then as a result of both of those things, we have racial disparities. And those are sort of differences in measurable social outcomes that are based in race. And we'll refer back to these things throughout the presentation. So government's role in creating racial disparities spans a lot of things, right? And so unfortunately for a long time in our country, our country was created on a model of institutional racism, and what that means is that for a long time, everything from where you live to who you marry, where you want to work, where you can buy a house, if you can buy a house, all of those things were determined by race. And so here on this slide, we have sort of a diagram here, and it really looks at several areas where we have seen really racist explicit policies and sort of where there's also connections and sort of where the disparities are today. And so that includes everything from land and citizenship to humanity, education, jobs, housing, the criminal justice system, and also health. Now we're going to turn our attention to taking a look at some of the racial disparities that we know of in the city of Bloomington. And so we have racial disparities in many areas, right? And so Bloomington isn't unique in this. And this is something that we have throughout the state and throughout the country. We have racial disparities in the area of education, in the area of home ownership, and we'll spend some time talking about this later. Employment, healthcare, income, and even the criminal justice system. And so, like I said, this presentation will be available if you really want to dive deep into the data there. But I want us to spend some time on this slide here because what I would like for us to do is really think about how do all those things connect, right? And so how does the law, racially explicit laws from years ago, connect to the fact that we have racial disparities in the present day? And so here on the slide is a diagram that connects sort of those institutional practice and those federal practices and really looks at how they tie to racial disparities. And so at the top of this slide here, the text here is a little hard to see, but I'll describe it. At the top of the slide here, we look at a policy, so a federal policy that was administered by the Federal Housing Administration. And this policy is a policy called redlining. By a show of hands, who here has heard of redlining before? Right? It's something that people have talked about, especially here in like the last 10 years, and so a lot of people know about it. And this policy, which was a federal policy, refused to provide mortgages on homes that were in areas that they considered undesirable. And those were homes where there was a significant portion of people who were not white, and homes where African Americans lived, or areas, I should say, where African American lives, were considered extremely undesirable. And so because of that policy, there was this institutional practice that came about called contract buying. So because BIPOC community members weren't able to get mortgages on their home, the practice of contract buying was, for many people, the only option. And what contract buying was that you really didn't have any sort of security in purchasing a home, and every payment was an opportunity for you to get to sort of this finish line when you would own something. And so it was a really risky process. The other thing that was happening during this period of time, which was like the 1940s, is that there were a lot of incentives that were being given to people. And so one of those incentives that really tie into the housing complex is the GI Bill, right? And so the GI Bill, in addition to many other things, made it possible for people to get low-cost loans on houses. But unfortunately, through practices, those benefits of the GI Bill were not available to many of the Black and Hispanic people who also participated in World War II. I think it was 1.2 million African Americans and about 500,000 Hispanic people who participated in that war. But they were not able to take on the advantages of the GI Bill and get some of those low-cost or low-interest homes. Another thing that's important to think about when we look at how the dots are connected is another institutional practice, and that's the practice of having racial covenants and deeds. Show of hands again, who here has heard of racial covenants? Perfect. And so racial covenants was included in a deed, so it was a legal practice. And what that meant is that if you had a deed on a home that had a racial covenant, you were restricted from selling that home to someone who was within this restricted category. And so many of these racial covenants restricted broadly those people who were not white. Oftentimes they would explicitly call out African Americans or indigenous people or things of that nature. But it made it almost impossible for even someone who wanted to sell their home to someone who was not white to do so. And by a lot of the research that has been done in the last 5 years that look at how racial covenants appeared in Minnesota by an organization called Map and Prejudice, through their work, we know that we had those racial covenants and deeds in homes in Bloomington as well. The other thing that's important to consider, I talked about the GI Bill and how people were able to take advantage and really purchase homes from that. It was during that period of time that the suburbs really came about, right? And so as the people were buying homes and moving out into the suburbs and they had incentives to do that, BIPOC communities were not able to participate in that. Another thing that's connected here, pardon me, is an institutional practice called blockbusting. Show of hands again. Anyone heard of that before? Not as many. So blockbusting was a practice where real estate agents would go into a community and sometimes they would hire people to like just be in the community, people who were not white, and they would say to owners, you know, there's a lot of people who are coming into your community who are not white, and so you need to sell now before your community changes. And then people would leave communities out of fear. So you may have heard the terminology white flight before. So they would leave those communities and people were able to buy properties at really low cost and then sell them to people who moved into the neighborhood later at rates exceedingly above market value. Another practice, sort of institutional practice that really connects to the disparities that we see in the housing area is subprime mortgages. And so this is a more recent phenomenon. Who here, show of hands again, have heard about that, right? We all know about sort of the role of subprime mortgages and the housing recession that we had in 2019. One of the things that we may not know as much about is sort of the disproportionate impact that had on BIPOC communities. And so there's federal reports, reports by nonprofits, and then also some reports by lenders themselves that really speak to that disproportionate impact. And so how BIPOC communities were really targeted in those subprime mortgages. And also just really looking at the disparities and how people are able to purchase home. So white, low income people who are looking to buy a home. So if you're going in to a lender and saying, hey, I want to purchase a home, and you're white and you have a low income, you're more likely to be approved than someone who's black or Hispanic with a really high income, even when all those other considerations like credit and things like that are constant. And so this is sort of really a deep dive into how all these things are connected, the law, society, and it really helps us to understand how do we get to where we are. And so against the backdrop of what I just talked about, on the right hand of the presentation here, we have data that really speaks to the racial disparities that we have in housing in Bloomington. So in Bloomington, 80% of our black households are renters, 66% of our other or two or more racist households are renters. 64% of American Indian households are renters. 61% of Hispanic households are renters. 30% of Asian households are renters. And then 20% of our white households are renters. And so hopefully by spending some time here on this slide, you're able to really understand how those things, racial inequities, institutional racism, how they combine lead to the racial disparities that we have. I'll stop there and just see if there are any questions.
Any questions? You can go ahead.
Thank you. And so now I'm going to turn our attention to how do we center racial equity in our budget considerations. And so in order for you to really center racial equity in your budget considerations, the best way to do that, or sort of my suggestion for how you should do that, is to use racial equity tools. The racial equity tool that we'll describe today, is sort of modeled today, is something called a racial equity impact assessment. And so a racial equity impact assessment essentially is a list of questions on the form that help you really understand the impact of any decision that you're going to make, how that is going to impact racial and ethnic groups, and how you can identify unintended consequences, and then also how you can mitigate any sort of adverse consequences that come up. And so I will go through here with you today what it feels like to use a racial equity impact assessment, and we will do that in looking at sort of considerations to budget cuts both in program and services, and then also property tax levies. And so the racial equity impact assessment process, it starts with data, right? And so you get some data, you dig into that data, and then you go out and do community engagement. And sometimes community and stakeholders have additional data that's provided to you. And then you do analysis and really say, well, what does the data say? Who's benefiting from this? Who's burdened by these decisions? And then you make a decision and could do that continual evaluation, right? So even after the decision is made, it's important to evaluate and make sure that things are staying on track. And so in a full racial equity form that we use here in the city, there's about 10 to 12 questions. But in a short form that we use when we're making decisions sort of in a hurry, or when we don't have sort of access to a lot of data, we really look at 3 key questions. And those questions are: 1, what racial or ethnic groups are burdened and benefited by the decision? 2, what are the unintended consequences that could harm racial or ethnic groups impacted by the decision? And then 3, how could adverse impacts be prevented or minimized? And so at this point in the presentation, I'm going to walk you through what it would be, sort of an example of what would it be like to use a racial equity impact assessment when you're looking at program and service reductions. And so this is a fictional example, but it will be sort of an example of how you could apply this. And then after we're done discussing this slide, that's when I'm going to call on volunteers, and we're really going to dig into what it would be like to use a racial equity impact assessment and looking at property tax levies. And for that example, we'll use real data that we'll get from Matt, the city assessor, and really get a feel for what that is like. And so in our fictional example, we have a program, and it's the middle school summer camp program. And so in the data that's been provided to us, we know that 65% of program participants are BIPOC residents. We did some community engagement and stakeholder engagement, and we learned from many people that the program is a staple in the community. We also learned that someone said private summer camps are really expensive, so we really rely on this program. Someone else told us that the summer camp is extremely inclusive of all races and backgrounds, so we like to send our children there. Someone else, a father, told us that I would have to leave my children at home with their 14-year-old brother if this summer program didn't exist. And then we also did some stakeholder engagement with city staff and learned that staff are short-staffed, right? And so they would like to continue the program, but there may not be enough staff to run it. And so in doing an analysis, we turned to those 3 key questions, right? And so looking at the data, we recognize that there is a benefit to BIPOC residents, right? And so knowing the demographics of our city, which is about 70 to 30%, 70% white, a little over 20, I think 8% BIPOC, with 65% of the program participants being BIPOC residents, then that shows that there's a benefit there. And so then we start to think about what are the unintended consequences, right, of having reductions to this program. And when you look at what are the unintended consequences, you do that both from if you make the reduction, so if you move forward with reducing this program, and so this program isn't in existence anymore, and then also look at what are the unintended consequences, even if this is a benefit and you keep the program. Both parts of that analysis are important. And so without a reduction, right, unsupervised youth may be unsupervised, and there may be some mental health strains on low-income families, right? And so if we do take into account that there's a reduction, there may be some insufficient staff support. And then we look at how could we mitigate some of these issues. And so if we take this program away, then we have to think about what could we do to mitigate those adverse impacts. And so if we take the program away, so with the reduction, one thing that we could do to mitigate those adverse impacts is connect potential program participants with other low-cost or no-cost summer care providers. If we keep the program, then we still have to think about what are the unintended consequences. Because remember, our stakeholders told us that they're short-staffed. And so one thing that we could do to mitigate those unintended consequences is maybe recruit community members to serve as volunteers. Now, remember, this is a fictional example. But what I'm hoping is that you'll be able to walk away with sort of what does it feel like to do this, and how do you go through the process of asking yourself these questions, balancing the concerns that you have, and get to a decision. And the decision-making process is really the toughest part of the work, right? And so it's important to be intentional and thoughtful throughout the analysis process, but in the end, you do have to make a decision and evaluate that. And so in making your decision, you balance all concerns, and then you also implement any mitigation strategies that you've identified and continue to monitor the impact. Any questions on that?
Any questions? So I do have one question about this. So one of the things that we've been talking about as we've been kind of getting our feet underneath us here is the number of decisions that we have to make. And when I think about applying a tool like this, one of the things that I think about is making sure that we have, based on the number of decisions that we're making, that we have enough time in order to give this the consideration that it's due. So I don't know that I really. I guess my question would be for the staff to kind of come and tell us a little bit about kind of how we might incorporate that into the process in a way that allows us to make the decisions that we have to make and allows us to incorporate these sorts of considerations into those decisions.
Yeah, Chair Peterson. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation about how you could use this in a situation like this where there are a lot of decisions to be made. But the short answer is that you would get to a point where you have sort of the menu of things that you're looking at doing and apply a racial equity impact assessment to that in its entirety, as opposed to doing this to each and every program or service.
Okay, that's a good idea.
And then I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, and I didn't run this past Jamie, but I would offer my services to the committee too if you're needing help to sort of think about what does it look like to do that racial equity impact assessment once we're at a place that we have a menu of things that we're thinking about.
I'm glad you offered, because I was going to offer your services to the
Well,
committee.
look at that. My boss said it's okay.
Other questions before she goes on? Not seeing any. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. So at this point is where we give it a try. Remember, the teaching in me wants this to happen. And so I'm going to ask for 5 volunteers. And Kari, once we have our volunteers, we'll hand you a piece of paper. And we'll tell you a little more about what you do with that piece of paper once we get volunteers. So not everyone at once.
Come on, Neil, you can be able. Do we have 5?
Thank you.
We have 5? Looks like we got 5. Okay.
I got all kinds of them.
It's going to twist Neil's arm there, but it doesn't look like arm twisting was necessary.
Awesome. And so what we're going to do now is really focus on how we use a racial equity impact assessment and looking at the impact of a property tax levy on BIPOC communities. And so the data that we have here, and so this isn't fictional data, that we have here to start with is data that is produced by the CDC. And here on the left side of the presentation is a diagram, and the CDC produces a social vulnerability index. And what this is just a formula that says, based on what we know, and they take into consideration 15 different things. So poverty, unemployment, income, education, disability status, people's ESO, so maybe people who have English as a second language, crowding in homes, mobile homes, disability, all of those different things that can make someone a part of a vulnerable population. They take in consideration those 15 categories, and then they tell you by looking at your population and where people are, which of your census tracts are most vulnerable. And they do this to help us predict who would be most vulnerable in case of a external stressor, like a man-made or unman-made sort of health crisis. And so that's exactly where we find ourselves at this moment, right? We have a global pandemic, and the CDC SVI really is that information that helps us identify who's most vulnerable. And so if you look at the map, you'll see that there's different colors. The blue colors, the dark purple and the blue, identify the most vulnerable census tracts in the city of Bloomington. You'll also see some circles on the map. And so those circles identify where we have the larger concentrations of people who are non-white. So really where our BIPOC communities are. And what we see in this map is that those areas that are most vulnerable, right, are also the areas where we have the highest concentration of non-white residents. And so it's against this backdrop that we will look at more data. And that data is going to come from Matt, our city assessor. But before we move to Matt to sort of answer some questions for us, I want to talk to you a little bit about what you have in front of you for those volunteers. So for those people who volunteered, you have a question in front of you. Those questions should be numbered. There should be a number somewhere on them. And the way that this works is we're going to assume that we've had data in front of us, and now we have our expert, the city assessor, here to answer some of those questions. And the questions that are on the paper are the type of questions that you would want to ask when you're doing an analysis of the data. And so I sort of pre-prepared those questions for you, and we have our expert here to help walk us through some of those questions. And so what I would like for you to do is the person who has question number 1 to just read it aloud, and then I'm going to turn over the presentation to Matt, and we'll spend about 15 minutes going through questions 1 through 5.
So I have number 1. We know a significant number of BIPOC residents are renters. How does a property tax levy impact multi-housing units, and what are the direct impacts on renters?
Okay. So, Mr. Chair and members of the commission, could you repeat the question number 1 as we got, and so I have a lot of data that's not necessarily in the order of the questions, so I want to make sure that I answer those questions the best I can in the order that you're reading them.
So again, number 1 is we know a significant number of BIPOC residents are renters. How does a property tax levy impact multi-housing units? And then what are the direct impacts on renters?
Yeah. So one of the things that Faith asked us was, what percentage of rent does renters pay, and is there a correlation between the monthly rent and what percentage property taxes kind of make up of that rent? And so we kind of went into a little bit of a deep dive and kind of looking at the way the state classifies multifamily residential. And so I do want to start there. And as I said earlier, when I was showing state classification rates, the legislature has, over the years, addressed how the proportionate share that multifamily pays. And it happened it was basically the Pay 2001 or Pay 2002 tax reform. Prior to 2001, multifamily and commercial, at least on the first tier, paid the same class rate of 2.4%. Going forward, that actually ratcheted down over a 3-year period to where it's at presently, 1.25% for the market value of multifamily. But keep in mind that single-family residential is still at 1% on that first 500,000 and 1.25% on anything over. And the discussion back around property tax reform was the idea was a house is a house is a house, and so they were trying to align the services that were being provided and paid for by property tax. So that slide kind of number one. And one of the things that we looked at was the impact that rent has on, and I'm looking for it here. So in 2000, let me start the presentation from right here.
Yep, that was it.
Is that it?
Nope, to the right.
To the right.
Oh, there you go.
There it is. So you can see tax reform actually show up here in this data. Pre-2001, property taxes as a percentage of the metro rent, and I showed that earlier of what metro rent was, and that was intentional. Post-2001 tax reform, rent actually declined to about 7-8% of market rent. And in the last few years, it started to climb about 10%. And I intentionally set these two axes to the exact same scale, so you can see the relationship. We got monthly rent on the left side and property taxes per unit on the right side per month. That's not per, yes, that's annually, sorry. No, all of this is per monthly. Sorry, so $1,400 a month, $140 a month in tax. So it's a 10% share. But even in the last 5 years, that's grown. And in the city of Bloomington, if we just look at it as a straight percentage of the rent, it's gone from about 7-8% in the early 2000s, and now in the last 3-4 years, as rent has increased, so has property taxes, but that percentage has ticked up 1% or so a year. So trying to do a deep dive and look at how property tax shows up as a portion of rent. So that was one of the dives that we did.
Question number two.
I've got question number two. We know that naturally occurring affordable housing properties are concentrated in those CDC high vulnerability areas. Do we have examples about how property tax increases have impacted renters in those properties over the years in the naturally occurring affordable housing?
So, Mr. Chair, it doesn't show up directly, but what I would say is it's interesting. This particular slide shows, again, market rent over a 25-year period, and then the relative flat values that were seen in all of basically 2000. And anybody who's participated in the multifamily market and looking at kind of that natural affordable housing, the value per unit on those over that better part of 15 years was right around $50,000 to $55,000 a unit. That's where those values were being valued at. In the last 5 years, those values have increased from in the 50s and 60s all the way up into the $100,000 a unit. Those values have greatly increased. Only speculation, and I actually would like to do a little bit deeper dive into this, but as rent increases, value does increase, but usually not to the extent that there has to be something that's also decreasing in order for value to increase so much. And so the rest of the expenses for these multifamily units, my corollary is that they wouldn't be increasing as much. And so the value is created based off of the rental increase. Property taxes is tied directly to value. We know that. But I do believe that, that burden has increased over the last 4 or 5 years substantially as values in multifamily has increased.
Question 3.
Does a property tax levy impact all homeowners equitably?
No, I mean, the tax system itself, I'm going to back all the way up here to this slide here. We focus in on the median value home. We tend to look at what is the typical home in Bloomington, how is it impacted, and we try to get an understanding of where that measure happens. But the reality is the city sets one levy. Our values, depending on the way home values or commercial values or industrial values or multifamily values, however those are changing, we're required by the state of Minnesota to apply that valuation metrics. We're supposed to be at 90 to 105% of all property value. That's the state charge. And so in situations where we're staring at this right here, homes that are valued under $200,000 are increasing more than homes above $200,000. The city sets one rate, and that is just that math of the levy and the property tax base. How it gets applied does affect different homes in town differently. It also affects different classes of property. And what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, multifamily residential has seen a significant increase. In some cases, the values have doubled almost in the last 5 to 7 years. So the levy does not impact everybody equally in that regard.
Question 4.
We know many single-family homes in the CDC high vulnerability areas are below the median value. How have these property values shifted over time?
I don't have specific data on that. If you look back at the in the assessment report that we do publish, we do list it by neighborhood, and you can kind of see how property values have changed over time. One of the slides that I used earlier was the median value home slide, and you can see that. Let's see here. That median value increased, was at 247, and then it decreased to 188, and then back up to 246, and now 286. So, and the example that we answered earlier is, the home on in that more $500,000-$600,000 range didn't decrease as much in value. Didn't bounce back as much. It was a more stable investment, and also pair that with the foreclosure crisis and the subprime lending did impact the median value home and even lower valued homes from that.
We've got a question right here. Go ahead.
Jessica, could you repeat the question, please?
We know many single-family homes in the CDC high vulnerability areas are below the median value. How have these property values shifted over time?
So, and just restating that is, when the market declined, those values decreased, and so the shift actually went to commercial, industrial, and to higher valued homes. And then when they increase, the shift comes back towards them. That's that hydraulic nature of the property tax system.
Mr. Chair and committee members, what we'll do in our follow-up information after the meeting is we'll highlight the pages in the assessing report that point to that information.
Yep.
And then question 5.
Yes, how may renters, homeowners recover the cost incurred if a levy is imposed?
That goes back to Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I can't read your name again, board member. That goes back to the property tax and the renters property tax refund information. That is the state's way of trying to make sure that those that either on fixed income or have less income for whatever given reason is able to stay in their home longer through the property tax refund program. That's the state's way of bridging that gap.
So am I remembering right on that? So that's roughly that 70,000, 80,000 household income level and below that could access that?
For renters, it's below 62,340. Can access the rental side of the household income. On the single-family residential, it's all the way up to 115,000, and these do adjust annually for inflation. So this is the 2019 property tax filings.
Thank you all so much for participating in that activity. Thank you so much, City Assessor, our expert for tonight. I appreciate you modeling this with the committee, and hopefully you've been able to sort of get an example and a feel for what it would feel like if you were using a racial equity impact assessment to really look at the impact of property tax levies on our BIPOC communities. And so, Matt, if you would slide me that mouse, I'll wrap up my presentation with really just talking about what resources are available to the committee and how, in my role as a racial equity coordinator, I can be of assistance to this group. And so one thing that I want to talk about is community engagement. In the presentation, we talked about how this is an important part of the racial equity impact assessment. And so when you're thinking about community engagement, this is really connecting with people. So using this example here, we're still talking about property tax levies. The way you could do that was connecting with renters and homeowners in areas that you know will have a disproportionate impact. Working with the city's co-ed, Community Outreach and Engagement Division, and then also working with trusted partners, going to places where people feel familiar, places that are comfortable for them to get that information and to interact with them, and then making sure that there's continued dialogue, right? And so reaching out to the community to see how they're impacted and then continue that conversation throughout. During the decision-making and evaluation phases, Chair Peterson, you asked a question earlier about, so how do we do this, right, when we have a lot of things to think about? My suggestion and advice to you would be, once you have that menu of items and the things that you're thinking about proposing to the council, that you apply a racial equity impact assessment to that as a collective, as opposed to each and every decision that you make. And then in that process, you would implement any sort of mitigation strategies. And here you would just recommend, right? These are the sort of the mitigation strategies that we've talked to that could accompany this menu of items, and then monitor impact. And then lastly, in terms of resources, what's available to this committee. And so the racial equity impact assessment form, both the short form and the long form, could be made available to this committee. I mentioned earlier that I'll put my services to help walk through that process and really think about what it is, and then really look into city staff to provide additional data if we need that in order to complete the assessment, and working with our co-ed department to do that community engagement and stakeholder engagement work. And so that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Any questions? Josh.
Mr. Chair, Faith, that was excellent work. Thank you. As you're thinking about our work and contemplating a combination of tax increases or budget cuts, I, as one member of the commission, would value your expertise about kind of areas where we could potentially look, if not, not necessarily tonight, but as we do this work, where you think we could center in the racial equity work. So if there's certain areas that you could help guide and give consultation to the committee, I think that would be valuable.
Yeah. Chair Peterson, committee member Josh, is that correct? I'm happy to do that. At the moment, I don't know what that would look like, but we can definitely think about it, and I can consult with the project managers and think about how do we fold that into this process.
Other questions? John?
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure how to ask this question, but how much does the state control what we are able to do as a city? Can we actually impact the lower income housing market in a way that's favorable to them, or are we stuck with state rules that's that institutional racism that's kind of stuck in the system? How much can we deviate from that, or can't we deviate from that? I'm just kind of perplexed at how much freedom we'd have to adjust the metrics here so we would have a more favorable outcome from those that are hurting the most. But if the state says, oh, no, you can't do that, you have to apply certain rules, we end up in the same place. I don't know if that's a statement or a question, but I'm kind of perplexed as where the state offers or demands oversight.
Mr. Chair and committee members, I'll take a crack at it, and if somebody wants to bail me out, then that's fine too. You're correct. We have pretty significant parameters around what we must do and what we can do when it comes to our valuation of a property and the tax levy that's assessed over the city. So the fact is that we're not going to be able to have our own local circuit breaker, as it were, different than what the state does. So the point of this exercise is to make sure that the decisions we're making are fully conscious of who's being impacted by those decisions, recognizing that we're going to be limited in how we may buttress some of those impacts, but that may influence ultimately the decisions we make if we determine that some burden is going to be too much burden and then having to maybe take a different run at it. But you're right, the especially in the area of property assessment, valuation, and tax, we have very, very little flexibility.
That's frustrating because the problem we want to fix the most seems like the least approachable. And so that by an X factor or whatever makes our job more difficult if we want to do something that where the help is needed the most. I don't know how we get there. If the state says you can't do that, you got to one size fits all.
Right.
So
we've got to be very creative, I think, when we get to that.
So Chair Peterson, committee member John, is that correct? I would say that you sound like a racial equity coordinator, right? I feel a lot like that in the job that I do, right? And so we walked through the example with housing, and you can see how there are many different things, many different laws, many different practices, both from a federal level, state level, and then individual actions that impact those disparities. And so there isn't a quick fix to any of these problems. And sort of my resolve as a racial equity coordinator now, offer this to the committee too, is to think about where you can make the most impact. And that's what the racial equity impact assessment is about, so that you can really think through what are you doing with the decisions that you make, and then really focusing on how do you mitigate any sort of adverse impact. And so really focusing on what you have control over will be important, and then trying to move the work forward from there.
Yeah, if I may, make it clear to us what some of those things are. Mm-hmm. Not pie in the sky, but what we can actually do that would have an impact. So if you would help us think about it in a way that you may have 10 decisions to make or 10 ways you want to get there, but only 2 you really have control over. I want to make sure I understand what those 2 are. And again, I'm just making up numbers. But want to end up being as effective as possible given the restrictions of outside influences.
It's Akia and then John, or excuse me, Josh. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Peterson. I just wanted to respond to you, John, maybe, and also get maybe confirmation from Matt. But to the first comment you made about houses in like the SVI that have depressed values, a way to kind of maybe offset those or depressed values would be that homeowners refund thing by the state that Matt mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So that maybe might be one way that it's offset, you know, their values are depressed at the moment. And I think I had a second comment, but I think it was more like I could be off base. So Matt, please affirm whether or not I am, is my second comment about how we could kind of address it. We can't do it from a racial equity lens, but the state kind of has a method of compensating, probably.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Member Azure, I think I got that.
Sorry.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Wow, I messed that up. All right, sorry about that. I think it's awareness of the property tax refund program. I've done multiple presentations in front of multiple groups, including realtors and you know, the Chamber of Commerce and that, and there's not a lot of folks that know about that program. And I think there's even less renters that know about that program, as Faith and I were chatting about. So it's probably an awareness issue that program exists.
If I may, how much of a difference in the big picture does that make? Is that really impactful? If we made all the residents aware of this and people applied, will we have some sort of a tangible outcome?
Well, everybody's situation, Mr. Chair and Mr. Locks, everybody's situation is different depending on your federally adjusted gross income and what you pay in income taxes. And so that's it really does depend on the individual homeowner or renter's situation on what that percentage is. But it can be pretty hefty, almost a 30% return. Just looking at the median home value versus kind of the median household income, that metric alone is a 30% return.
That's a significant number.
Yes. And the beauty of that is it's not city money,
Right.
it's state money.
Josh.
Mr. Chair, members, I was just going to say there very well may be certain state or federal rules that will tie our hands. But this is a very innovative group of people that could come up with new tools in the toolbox that could help us reach just important social and economic outcomes. So I would just encourage us to keep an open mind. So, for example, we may make an action here that has an unintended consequence, but rather than cutting another program, we may actually invest in it, which could be seen as counterintuitive because we care deeply about reaching some equity. The second potential action step would be if we discover through our work that there's a series of state or federal laws that are perpetuating these outcomes that we don't accept, that gives the lobbyists for the city of Bloomington a kind of a to-do list. And I guess the committee can kind of work through that and tee up some of those issues that could then be brought to the legislature or the congressional delegation. So that's just kind of where my mind goes as we're thinking about some potential action steps on that front. But
Okay, any other questions? John.
I'm struck. I love that circuit breaker idea. I think it sounds like it really could be helpful to some, and we can probably all play a role in making sure the awareness is up in it. But I'm also struck that it's dependent on a couple of things. One is that you have income, so that you have a job, and therein is a big challenge. And I'm struck by some of the other data here that the folks that may or may not have a job, but the bucket of housing or rent that seems to be most inflating and whose assessments are going to go up the most just on the natural based on what the market has said the home values, on the residential side, the home values will be, is really the group that probably can afford that increase the very least. And so I don't want to be Debbie Downer on it because I love your advertisement for that program, but I think it probably has some pretty limited net positive effect given what I think we just learned tonight.
And Mr. Chair and member Joel? John? Any glasses?
That's all right.
You're wearing glasses.
I know that.
Different glasses.
Yeah, as the guy representing the property tax system, I don't have anything else to offer you on that.
Fair enough. It wasn't a criticism.
That's the best I got.
No,
but yes, it duly noted.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you, Faith.
Thank you very much.
Good.
Next up was going to be a talk about local social and economic indicators.
All right. Mr. Chair and committee members, our next discussion is actually building on that last one nicely. And this is just a little bit of data for you. And I'm going to move through this relatively quickly in consideration of the time. But I'm not going to make your consideration any easier based on what you just heard. But I want to talk about this presentation. Where do I go to find that? Which one is it, Kari? It's loaded, right?
Which one are you looking for?
The socioeconomic indicators?
Oh, no.
Oh,
It's
okay. Never mind. We'll walk through it in your packet, right? So you've got it in your packet. So I'll just walk you through the paper copy there. Sorry about that. I want to tell you a little bit about the background, though, of why we started putting this particular bit of data together. Since we were talking about the legislature, before this legislative session kicked off, we were talking about some of the things that we were going to be pursuing from the legislature and, trying to assess the likelihood of being successful. And one of the things that we recognize is that there's a perception of Bloomington outside of the city of Bloomington that may be different than the reality. And the perception of Bloomington, I think, by many, is that this is a community of greater means and wealth than maybe is the actual case. And the reason for that is that the 494 strip is historically been a significant contributor to the regional economy, that Mall of America is here, that Bloomington is a significant driver in the regional economy overall, and all of that is true, right? And I think that most legislators know that we have this really unique tax base situation where we've got 50% of our values in commercial property, which is certainly a benefit to the community. What that doesn't do is tell the whole story, though, but what that translates to. What it means is that Bloomington has historically been able to keep the property tax for residents relatively low, and that we've been able to invest in some services more than maybe what other communities have done. So we have a public health division here, and we do that in partnership with Richfield and Edina. We're the only cities, the three of us, other than Minneapolis, that have our own public health division. Otherwise, public health services are delivered through the counties around the rest of the state of Minnesota. We had, for 4 decades or more, a human services department. And just within the last couple of years, we did a strategic analysis of our community services in total, and we redefined the mission of our human services into a community outreach and engagement division. That is an example of a service that we do in Bloomington that most other cities don't do. and certainly most suburbs, right? And we're able to do that because we do have a broader tax base to build from. So that's true. But the whole story, when we start talking about our community, is that it is not the community from a demographic and income perspective that many people think that it is. So what we did was try to put together information. It's on page 76 of your packet. That's right, 76? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes.
So first we started looking at just the underlying demographics for the community, and we did this compared to many of our peer communities. And you'll see the first one, total population, obviously we're the largest suburb in the Twin Cities area. We're the fourth largest city in the state of Minnesota. Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Rochester are the only three cities larger than Bloomington. This number is from the American Community Survey for 2018. Our updated population number actually is just shy of 90,000. We're at about 89,000 right now, according to the Metropolitan Council's most recent population estimate. Median age, you can see that we are, amongst our peers, one of the older communities. That's not a surprise to anybody who's been here for a while, and I seem to recall when the committee members were introducing themselves, we have a number who have been here for a while, right? So it's not a surprise that we have an older population. Edina and Minnetonka, the only two communities that have a higher median age. Conversely, we are at the very bottom with only St. Louis Park lower than us in terms of the number of residents who are under the age of 18. Okay? So that, to the point that John Gibbs was mentioning earlier about how do we attract families to Bloomington, this is one of those things we look at. You know, as we partner with our school district and trying to figure out the future of the community, attraction is a significant strategic issue for us. And this is one of those indicators that we want to maintain strong enrollment in our schools. We need to drive up this number of people under the age of 18. And then the next slide, obviously, people over the age of 65, consistent with the median age slide, we have nearly 20% of our residents who are in that plus 65 category. Okay. So as you turn to page 77, here is where you start to see the story. And that is median household income. Bloomington is not even at the average of all of our peer communities, and actually quite a bit below it. Okay, and then if you go to the next slide, the poverty rate, Bloomington above the average line there, 6.8% of our community living at or below the poverty line. We look at free and reduced lunch in our student population, and this is another way to measure poverty in the community. And you see that over 40% of our students are on free and reduced lunch. Okay? So we can draw from, I think, the information we have that a good portion of the younger people in our community then are living below the poverty line, and also represent that lower economic strata. If you flip the page again, so here we see the median home value. Bloomington below the average for many of our peer communities, despite the fact that we are at the highest median value home price in our history, we're still below the average. So as people think about Bloomington, as part of the Fertile Crescent, as they call it, you know, the 494 there, we're very different in terms of our housing stock than is Plymouth or Eden Prairie or, you know, some parts of Minnetonka, in Edina, and then certainly the next ring of suburbs, places like Chanhassen and Lakeville, again, places that have more wealth in their residential properties. And that's a reflection of the age of the homes here in Bloomington. One of the things that Matt didn't include in his presentation, which is really interesting, you saw one slide that showed the distribution of median value homes throughout the community, right? And so what you see is that the housing stock from a price value or pricing perspective isn't different in many respects. you've probably heard that there's this perception of two Bloomingtons. There's an East Bloomington and there's a West Bloomington, right? And I know that our previous mayor used to drive him crazy, right? That whole East and West Bloomington, that's where our mantra of one Bloomington came up in our strategic plan, is trying to eliminate that perception. One of the most interesting stats that Matt and his team have identified in the home sale transactions over the last couple of years, where is the price per square foot for East Bloomington versus West Bloomington, Matt?
Right now, it's about $6 higher per square foot in East Bloomington versus West Bloomington.
No. So this idea that we have two different communities, the facts don't necessarily support it. Okay. Median rent. Again, this is getting to much of the conversation that we had today. There you go. The slideshow came back. Thank you. You want to go to the next group of slides? There we go. Can I move this now? Do I have control? So for our median rent, again, we are below the average, even though we've seen incredible increases over the last few years. Average one-bedroom rent, below the average. Average two-bedroom rent, right at the average. One of the interesting things about our rent rates is how that translates into what we're able to do from a development perspective in terms of trying to attract new development in multifamily residential, and how much the developers are able to get for those properties. We don't have a market established here similar to what you would have if you just went 10 miles down the road to the area of 494 and Highway 5. So right at Eden Prairie, there's a new multifamily project that was going in there. Matt, do you remember what the price per square foot was on those units? I don't remember the exact number, but it was about 10% higher than what the developer thought they could get over in the South Loop. Okay? So the market here is affecting what new development can be done here. And then monthly taxes for the Bloomington median value home. Like I said, we have historically been on the lower side of taxes for homeowners, and you see we're just below the average there. But this is also a reflection of property value. So there's a difference between, you'll hear tax rate, and then you'll hear the median value home. Those are two different things. Edina, you can see it's higher there. That does not mean that Edina has a higher tax rate. The median value home in Edina is quite a bit higher. And so it's a reflection of the home valuations as much as it is the tax rate policy for the city. There's a different slide that we use when we're looking at budget issues for the city council that many of you may remember seeing, where Bloomington is at the bottom of the peer comparisons for what is basically the bundle of services that we provide. And so that's our cost of government slide, where we take not just the property taxes, but the costs for utilities, what people pay for water and storm sewer and sewer. And then we also add in what the price is for garbage collection. So we have, in the last couple of years, gone to organized hauling here. Some of the other cities do have organized hauling, but most of them, that's an open process. So we look at what that cost is. And then for places that don't have softened water, we add in the cost of softening that needs to go into the individual home. What you see when you put the whole bundle of goods together is Bloomington's almost always on the bottom because the cost for utilities combined with the property taxes, it's just a really good deal here, what folks are paying for their services. And then homeless students by school district, you can see there that we're at about 1.5%, which is obviously a point of concern for us. And then there are a couple others that I haven't added into this slide deck yet, and I will. I'll get this information. It was just shared with our city council over the last couple meetings by our staff in the HRA. One of the issues that we're seeing in the community right now is an immediate and urgent need for rental assistance. So we have been directing some funds that we're receiving from the federal government as part of the Pandemic Relief Act to VEEP, who is administering rental assistance. They are providing a significant amount of rental assistance in our community right now. We've already sent $200,000 to them a couple months ago, and just Monday night authorized another $270,000. And we're expecting there's probably going to be a request in another couple months. We also are looking at the impact of mortgage foreclosure, but that one, because of the way that the foreclosure process works, is going to take a few months before we start to see if there are any trends or emerging needs in that area. But we know that most of our BIPOC community members and people who are in the lower economic strata in our community are in our rental community. And so there's a real pressure right now for rental assistance. In fact, the renter household income, the median income for renters is $49,000, which compared to our community-wide household income average was, what was that number, 74,000? 72,000, right? Yep. So the renter median income is significantly lower. And then one of the things that we also shared with the council is housing cost burden. There's a number in the industry when we're talking about burden of 30%. So if a homeowner has a mortgage that represents more than 30% of their household income, or if a renter is in a unit that costs more than 30% of their income, they're considered to be cost burdened by their housing cost. In Bloomington, about 3/4 of our homeowners still have a mortgage on the property. It's about 15,000 out of those 21,000 properties. And of those homeowners, 24% of them are cost burdened by their mortgage. So in other words, 24% of our homeowners have a mortgage that's greater than 30% of their household income. For renters, that number is 43%. Okay. So you can see that the increasing cost of housing, especially in our rental communities, some of it is a result of property taxes, some of it is a result of the market. It's more the market currently. But you can see that the impact of increasing housing cost is dramatically affecting lower income families in our community. And then one of the more recent emerging trends as a result of the pandemic is our unemployment numbers. Historically, we have really tracked well with Hennepin County and the Twin Cities region, which both of those have been below the statewide average, and the statewide average has been below the national average consistently up until the last couple months, because many people in our community work in the industries that are being hardest hit by the pandemic. That's in hospitality and in healthcare. And so the current unemployment rate in Bloomington has gone from 2.8% in March to 10.6% in May. So as we start looking forward and wanting to understand the impacts of the pandemic, whether they're going to be short-term or long-term, understanding what that employment status is within the community is going to be one of those inputs you'll want to be thinking about. So that is just a quick run through on sort of the underlying demographics of the community. And the reason that we're sharing this information, whether it's looking at things through the lens of racial equity or sharing this information about the demographics, is that we want to be having a fulsome conversation about who's being impacted by the decisions we're making, and what the level of stress is for our taxpayers as a result of decisions that or options that will be presented to the City Council. Going back to the presentation from Faith and some of the questions from the committee members, You may recall at the first meeting or two, we talked about how we're approaching this from a project management perspective. And for the city, we have several different elements of that project management that we're going to be utilizing. One is the racial equity lens. So we'll be working with Faith to put together a racial equity plan for the committee's work. So we'll know how we're going to assess these things as we have the conversation. And then we'll also be bringing an outreach and engagement plan, and we're going to bring a communications plan. So those are the three big pieces of our project management approach. The racial equity one, though, is the one that will factor most into the analysis of the options. So we'll get the additional details on the underlying demographics that I referenced put out to you in the follow-up information. I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Okay, any questions? Okay, well, I think that we filled our brains with statistics tonight.
We have.
And I want to thank everyone for being engaged until we got to the 9:30 time here. Thank you, Jamie, for that information. I think it's particularly, I think we oftentimes have a different reputation as a city than what is actually true, and it's useful to go through these and look at the different attributes of the city and where we're at today and what that means in terms of kind of challenges and opportunities inside the city. So that was the last item on the agenda, unless there's any other item to come forward. Jamie, did you have anything that you wanted to say?
Mr. Chair and committee members, going back to the administrative procedures in our newly adopted charter, just how we end our meetings. So I want to do a check-in to see if anybody has any additional questions that occurred to you in the course of the conversation. So let me pause there, see if there's any additional information that you would seek either tonight or at some point as follow-up.
Go ahead.
Chair Peterson, thanks. I do have a couple questions that we can talk about at our next meeting. It was a follow-up to, I think, maybe John's question or comment before about, are we benchmarking industry trends as in response to COVID, and to know how they'll be impacting our revenues coming forward in the next year, I guess. And then the other question is related to programs. I know what we'd call them fail-safe type programs that are funded by the general fund. So maybe we have a homelessness fund that helps people with hotel stays or something like that, or a school lunch program or whatever it might be. But what type of funds or what type of programs we have that are dependent on general fund or tax revenue, I guess, that could be impacted if we didn't support them.
Just for clarification, Akwi, are you talking about programs that are specifically working to mitigate some of the impacts of the pandemic? Or programs that are geared towards either racial equity or poverty in the community, those types of programs? Right. Okay.
The latter.
Okay.
Other comments or questions?
All right, Mr. Chair and committee members, then just setting a little bit of the expectation for the next meeting. The co-chairs and the project team are going to meet here in the next couple of days to talk about that. I appreciate the request from Aquia. Does anybody else have any additional requests for discussion at our upcoming meeting? Otherwise, the co-chairs and the staff will work to set those next couple of agenda and let you know as soon as possible what you can expect.
Yeah, and just to kind of talk a little bit again about the schedule, I think there's going to be two things that are going to start running in parallel. One is we're going to start having conversations about the preliminary levy and the recommendation that we need to make around that. And then we're going to start lining up departments to come and start talking about the department operations and what options there are in the department for having varying levels of service inside each of the departments. And the department conversations will run longer in terms of the number of meetings than the preliminary levy conversation, because we have more time to make decisions about that than we do around the preliminary levy. But those are really the two major kind of lines of conversation that we're going to have over the next couple months, is setting that preliminary levy and then coming up with both revenue scenarios and kind of spending scenarios that we're going to forward onto the council as we get to the end of our work for this year. Anything else for tonight? Okay, if not, the meeting stands adjourned.
Thank you, everybody.